Hello and welcome to PPMD's annual advocacy meeting. This is a town hall, and it's a virtual town hall this year because a couple things, pandemic got in our way, but we are celebrating our 20th anniversary of being on the Hill. This is Advocacy in Action. I'm Pat Furlong, President and CEO of PPMD.
And I'm Ryan Fisher, Chief Advocacy Officer of PPMD.
This has been a challenging year for all of us. The pandemic, and hopefully soon a vaccine for all of us, will open our world. But this year marks the anniversary of the Muscular Dystrophy Care Act. This town hall this year is 20 years after the first iteration of the Muscular Dystrophy Care Act. We're going to look back on those 20 years, and we've come a very long way. So we want to look back at where we were and where we are now. The landscape was entirely different long ago. There weren't trials, there were no care considerations. The landscape was pretty barren. We've come a long way, and there are lots of missing pieces and places to go, but we're on the march. This is our ecosystem. This means that all of our voices count. These are all of the people in our ecosystem. I like to say this is our us. Government representatives, academics, clinics, economic factors, regulations, Congress, companies, all of us together. But at the center and heart of all of this is patients and families.
That's right. And this virtual town hall will feature many who make up that ecosystem, including a cross-section of patients, families, members of Congress, federal agency representatives. What we realized early on in our advocacy efforts is that no one person, no one organization could do this alone. And the progress to date has been because of collaborative and persistent advocacy across our space. And really what started it all, as Pat mentioned, was passage of the MD Care Act. And you can pull up that first slide on the MD Care Act. Here we see this has been landmark legislation that was passed to really usher in a coordinated effort for a federal investment. The original legislation was passed in 2001. The bill mandated that the National Institutes of Health fund and establish research centers of excellence so we could move those early promising ideas for therapy development into clinical testing. The bill also established the very first data and tracking surveillance program out of CDC so we could better understand the number of people with Duchenne in the U.S. and collect other health information about the care they receive. And finally, it created a Muscular Dystrophy Coordinating Committee, or MDCC, in order to link federal agencies that touch Duchenne, requiring them to meet regularly and create an action plan. In 2008, the bill was reauthorized. Here we worked with Congress to update the legislation to add to the progress made since 2001. This bill mandated that for the first time ever, care considerations would be developed in partnership with the Center for Disease Control and advocacy groups in order to better standardize how care is delivered, which then actually went global. The bill built on the MD StarNet program and expanded it into additional data collection. It also expanded our reach into NIH for the Institutes of Heart, Lung, and Blood, because we know that the heart is a muscle too. And then in 2014, additional amendments were added thanks to your advocacy. This expanded the care considerations into adults because the lifespan had been increased due to those advancements in care. The 2014 bill also mandated that the MD StarNet program would share data, the data that had been collected to date, towards other federal agencies. And finally, the bill expanded research efforts into unmet needs at NIH around cardiac, pulmonary, and endocrinology. In short, this bill has been a game changer, and we were really able to change the landscape because of it. None of it would be possible without our congressional champions who led the charge. Champions like Senator Roger Wicker, right, Pat?
Yes, I first met Roger Wicker just after I met Joel Wood. Joel's son James had been diagnosed with Duchenne, and Joel and I talked about the federal investment in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which was very, very little, almost something you couldn't count. So at that time, now Senator Roger Wicker was in the House of Representatives. Joel and I visited with Mr. Wicker in the House and asked him, how do we change the landscape in Duchenne muscular dystrophy? Senator Wicker smiled and said, let's write us up a piece of legislation, and that was the beginnings of the Muscular Dystrophy Care Act. Let's hear from Senator Wicker.
Hello, I'm Senator Roger Wicker from Mississippi. I'm glad to be working alongside you in the fight against muscular dystrophy. I joined this battle almost 20 years ago when a fellow Mississippian told me about his son's diagnosis with Duchenne. He helped me understand that every minute matters for those living with rare diseases and their families. That led me to introduce the MD Care Act, which dedicated the first federal research dollars for DMD. Since then, the federal government has invested over $500 million in DMD research. With this support, researchers have made significant strides in the fight against this fatal disease. Now there are 4 approved therapies to treat DMD, and several other therapies are currently in the pipeline. As the science continues to advance, it is critical that we keep investigating in groundbreaking research. Each year, I lead a letter to the Senate Appropriations Committee requesting funding for Duchenne research. This fiscal year, the package included $6 million for this disease at the CDC and $10 million at the Department of Defense. I also plan to reintroduce the Benefit Act this Congress. This critical bipartisan legislation would ensure that patient experiences are considered as the FDA decides whether to approve a new therapy. It also would work to improve the FDA's benefit risk framework, an important step in the drug approval process. I intend to keep pressing forward in the fight against muscular dystrophy. There are still challenges ahead, but the gains we have made hold the promise of even greater breakthroughs to come, and one day, a cure. Thank you.
We are so grateful to the Senator's leadership and support of this community and of our families. And we're also grateful to all the families who have developed relationships with their members of Congress to create champions for Duchenne. People like Sherry Gunvelson.
Sherry was great. Sherry was the first advocate that I met in Washington, D.C. Sherry's son, Jacob, had been diagnosed with Duchenne. And I had been on the phone with Sherry talking back and forth, and I understood that she was calling every single representative that she had from her state of Minnesota. And then I heard she was calling every other representative as well. We met in Washington, D.C., and it was so wonderful to see and so wonderful to be with another advocate. Sherry's friend became Paul Wellstone. So let's hear a few words from Sherry.
Hello. My name is Sherry Gunvelson, and I'm a nurse. I live with our family in northern Minnesota on a farm 20 miles from the only stoplight in the county. If someone would have told me years ago that I would have the only healthcare bill passed in the 107th hang in my living room, I'd say they were crazy. Thank you so much for inviting me to this landmark event. And thank you, Pat, Ryan, Kim, and crew for all you do. They're a great team, and advocates, just follow their lead. Advocates, I want to thank you for everything you do. It's because of you, our son Jacob, who is 29, is alive. He's graduated from college, and he worked as a high school social worker, part-time. When Jacob was diagnosed 23 years ago, I was shocked there was no treatment and no research, and very little research. And I knew the only way, actually, that he would live is if there was fair federal research dollars. I was a regular working mom, juggling 3 kids, going in 3 directions, but I had nothing to lose, so I started making phone calls to my elected officials and showing up at events where they were speaking with my kids and to talk to them about this unfair federal funding for this disease. When I met with our Congressman Peterson, who's ranking member of the Ag Committee, for the first time, and told him I was going to D.C. and I'd like his help, and he said, "Sherry, I'm an Ag guy. What can I do to help you?" I said, "Well, you are co-chair of the Blue Dog Caucus." I told him I thought they should know about this unfairness in federal funding for this disease. And he agreed, yes, they should know about it. I said, well, I'd like to talk to them when I go to D.C. And I did. Well, that ag guy became the House author, along with Roger Wicker, of the Muscular Dystrophy Care Act. Paul Wellstone was such a good man. One night he called me to ask me to call a mother of a newly diagnosed little boy because the mother was just devastated, which I did. Later that night, we saw Paul on C-SPAN. Paul's last race was very, very tough. So I called his office to see if we could help stuff envelopes or something, but we were 5 hours away, so I wasn't sure what we could do. The director called back and said, well, there is something you could do that was very important. This bill is huge, but it doesn't mean anything to the average Minnesotan unless they hear Jacob's story. Would you make an ad with him? But unfortunately, very sadly, right before the ad was going to air, Paul and his wife, Sheila, and daughter Marcia, and staff members died in a plane crash. So the ad didn't air. It is in the documentary Wellstone, which is on YouTube. I would like to share that ad with you now, so you could see a bit of Jacob and Paul.
Jacob's ultimate wish is to be a regular little boy. Jacob has Becker muscular dystrophy, and his muscles are beginning to deteriorate. I can honestly say that we really didn't have much hope before the work of Paul Wellstone. The MD Care Act, which Paul authored, was the first ever muscular dystrophy bill. Most boys have heroes that are professional baseball players or movie stars. Not Jacob. Jacob's hero is Paul Wellstone.
We really thank Sherry for all her advocacy, and it really shows that every story matters, every voice matters, and can make a difference. Because of people like Sherry and many in our community who've developed relationships, we've been able to ensure that Duchenne remains a top priority to the federal government, and that funding for Duchenne at critical agencies like the National Institutes of Health happens for our condition. And Pat, this brings us to our next panel, actually, to kick off with the National Institutes of Health, providing an overview of who they are and the connection to the MD Care Act.
Yes, Ryan, you're exactly right. And Sherry was wonderful, and certainly her voice has lent to all that we do. Let's show those slides about the National Institutes of Health, please. The National Institutes of Health is a big research environment. In fact, it's one of the largest research investors in the world, really investing in the health of everyone across every disease. There are, next slide please, 27 institutes in the National Institutes of Health. And of those 27, 5 are relevant to Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And they're all represented by acronyms. And sometimes it's really hard to sort of get your head around what acronyms. So just very carefully, NINDS is neurological disorders and stroke. Duchenne is a neurological disorder, or considered so. NIAMS, or National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal, fits in with muscle. HLBI, or National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, as Ryan mentioned before, that's about the heart, and we know the heart is a muscle too. NCATS, or National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. This is translating what you learn and the target you learn and how to get it into a drug that's going to hopefully benefit the people that it's designed to help. And then National Institute of Child Health, because Duchenne muscular dystrophy is a pediatric disease. This is really, really important to understand. So forgive us when we go to the acronyms. I think it's important just to know that all of these are relevant to us, and it shouldn't feel like alphabet soup to you. Next slide, please. What happened in National Institutes of Health in terms of 20 years? Well, as Sherry mentioned, Paul Wellstone, what a gift he was to our community And those sites in the National Institutes of Health that are centers of excellence were named Paul D. Wellstone Centers of Excellence, and there are 6 of them, and they're spread around the country. We know at UT Southwestern in Florida, in Iowa, Massachusetts, Boston, Rochester. All of these are centers of excellence focused on Duchenne and other muscle diseases. And if you think about the pipeline, you have to imagine that in the spending of that $43 billion budget of National Institutes of Health, a considerable amount out of those institutes has gone to Duchenne. There is not a therapy that is in development that hasn't been touched by the funding and the leverage of funds in the National Institutes of Health. Next slide, please. And if we think about 2001, in 2001, the investment was below $5 million. When we think about developing a drug today, there's this general comment, it takes $1 billion. So if you're below 5 million and we stayed there, we wouldn't make progress. But today, just as Senator Wicker said, we have a $500 million National Institutes of Health funding in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is really, really incredible. So with that, I'd love to talk about and introduce the panelists that we have for our next panel. We have some of our friends from the National Institutes of Health joining us today, and they are Dr. Glenn Nuckolls. Dr. Glenn Nuckolls is a program director of National Institute of Neurology, Disease and Stroke. Dr. Ann Pariser. Dr. Ann Pariser was once at the FDA, and now she's with NCATS, Center for Translation, and the Office of Rare Disease. And Dr. John Porter. Dr. John Porter was the program director of NINDS. Dr. Nuckolls had been at National Institute of Arthritis and Stroke. So these are the people who have been with us for 20 years. So with that, I'd love to start off and think about, could you reflect back to 20 years ago? And Ann, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, thank you, Pat. And I actually put together just a couple of brief slides just to try to illustrate the 20-year journey that we've been on. So those slides are coming up here. Yeah, here we go. So I think probably, as everybody knows, very simply, the story of any rare disease, is first defined as a category, began in 1983 with the passage of the Orphan Drug Act. Next, please. But it really hasn't stopped there. And I know this is a very busy slide, and it's got a lot of the alphabet soup that Pat was talking about, which I tried to define at the bottom. And don't worry, I won't go through every single one of these. But I think the environment, beginning at the FDA, really began to change in the 1990s. And this was actually because of the HIV epidemic, where patients were demanding more of a role and more of a sense of urgency for serious diseases that really hadn't existed prior to that. But it certainly didn't stop there. And then going into the 2000s, I think that's when rare diseases really became very much an area of importance. So right at the top there, I have HGP, which stands for Human Genome Project, and which I think many of you know was a large NIH initiative to try to define the human genome, where they undertook massive sequencing efforts, which was completed somewhere around 2003. And I think that just opened the door to a tremendous amount of genetic science, which of course didn't stop there and continues through this day. But just to speak very broadly, I think really from 2000 on, what we have seen with progressive legislation and priorities are movements towards greater flexibility, particularly for rare diseases and serious conditions. And very importantly, many more opportunities to hear patient voice, patient priorities, what is important to patients, and to try to help the agency hear from patients, the patient community, and to understand how this impacts on developing a drug, and what are the areas that really impact patients' lives. So that is just in a nutshell, very high level, but next, please. So as Pat mentioned, I started at FDA in 2000, and next, please. And then went, one more time. Yeah, and went to NCATS in 2017. And the question of what's changed in the past 20 years, and I think it's everything. everything. When I first got to FDA, there wasn't a lot going on with rare diseases, and that is not true now. The biggest category of new drug approvals at FDA now is rare diseases, and a lot of it has been really led by that genetic revolution. So next slide, please. So just as a kind of, this is a iceberg, of course, but it's a metaphor, I think, for drug development is what we see a lot is that little bit above the water, and that is really when things start entering clinical trials, and then at the very tippy top, those are the approved therapies. But there's just that massive amount of research and knowledge and experience that we all gain, and that's not going away. And we will continue to build on that. So much of this has been due to patients, to advocacy, to patient voices. I think very well illustrated for some of what we've just heard. So just urge you to just please keep telling your stories, keep asking for what it is that you need, and please keep telling the scientists, and because they will listen.
Thank you, Anne. That was really wonderful. And I totally agree. Every voice and every story matters because it changes the world we live in. Glenn, can you reach back 20 years ago and talk about where we were and what you see?
Sure. Thanks, Pat, and thanks, Ryan. Great to be here. So I've been a program director at the National Institutes of Health for about 17 years now. First, as Pat mentioned, at the National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases, which was led by Stephen Katz, the director and a real champion for muscular dystrophy research. About 6 years ago, I moved over to the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, and also took on responsibilities with the Muscular Dystrophy Coordinating Committee. But my primary job as a program director is really to provide guidance to researchers at universities across the country who are seeking funding from us to support their research projects. And we also monitor the progress on their grants, and I serve as a subject matter expert on the muscular dystrophies and for some of the other neuromuscular conditions to NIH senior leadership. Over the past 17 years that I've been involved, it's been really gratifying to have the researchers that I work with, develop their laboratory studies, make important discoveries, pursue potential therapies based on those discoveries, develop collaborations with industry partners, and to see those discoveries eventually to transition into potential therapies that are being treated or tested in clinical trials. So like folks like Jeff Chamberlain had been a grantee of mine for a long time, Eric Hoffman, Lee Sweeney, a lot of the kind of key leaders in research and in preclinical development in the muscular dystrophies, have been, I think, great people to work with, and I've been honored to have association with their work.
Thank you, Glenn. That's wonderful. And I know all of those investigators have had really wonderful experiences with you as well. Imaging DMD comes right out of NIAMS long ago, and we were thrilled to see that funded. John, you were there when the MD Care Act was passed and signed into law, and I remember you right at the beginning of the MDCC, and I know over time you've really worked on the research plan as well. So can you look back 20 years and talk about where you came in the door and how things have progressed?
So you got an hour, Pat?
I'd love to have an hour.
So I'm John Porter. Glenn Knuckles did a great job of describing my former job, because he took my position when I retired from the NINDS. So I was the program director, principally responsible for muscular dystrophy, but for 10 years, from 2004 to 2015. And just as Glenn, I was the program director, plus I was executive secretary for the Muscular Dystrophy Coordinating Committee. Pat, I wasn't quite there at the start, but the first Wellstones were funded right before I got there. And Glenn and I started almost exactly the same time. And the MDCC was just kicked off right before. But then we really tried to leverage those resources and do what we could for the field. As Glenn said, we're really facilitators. We help people get funded. We help research move forward. And, looking back to that early time, initially, the problem was that there was really little knowledge about how to develop a drug for Duchenne. Drug companies in academia, drug development in academia was focused on gene therapy, but it was really in the lab. It was in animal models. It hadn't moved into clinical trials yet. Companies, for the most part, didn't know how to deal with Duchenne. The rare disease model that Anne's described that's now so successful hadn't even really taken off. And so the companies looked at this disease and said, how do we get our hands around this? Advocacy, you guys were just learning how to leverage, how to push resources one against the other. And the NIH, which hadn't done that much pure drug development, sinking money into early stage drug discovery projects, hadn't really been happening. So that's the prelude to what we're going to be talking about, I think, is that a lot of other things have happened and been facilitated. The targets for drug discovery in Duchenne were multiple, but we didn't know which ones were important. And that was a lot of the individual research grants that have advanced knowledge there. The partnering hadn't happened. We didn't have academics working with industry very much and the other partners and bringing patients and families into the mix to help move things forward. So that had to happen. And some major NIH translational grants leveraged with some PPMD money and other things like Project Catalyst made a lot of that happen. We didn't know how to do trials. The initial efforts on doing trials were with repurposed drugs. They were poorly powered. And I think a lot of the trial funding has really made that better. We know what we're doing as far as endpoints and how to run clinical trials. And then finally, dealing with failure. You'll always have failure in drug development. It's a given. Not everything's going to work. But making sure you learn from that and making sure those lessons are disseminated. And I think we played an important part in that. So, what I see were a lot of problems at the beginning, but I think we've come a heck of a long way, and we've only achieved this by doing this together.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's certainly been a journey, right, to learn. When I think lots of us were hoping for sort of a single bullet, right, to get there.
Yeah, I agree. Getting back to the sort of the MD Care Act and the connection with NIH and the MD Care Act, Glenn, I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about the research plan and the Muscular Dystrophy Coordinating Committee and the role of that committee and maybe how it's evolved over time.
Sure. Mm-hmm. So I'm the designated federal official for this committee that was created in response to the MD Care Act, the Muscular Dystrophy Coordinating Committee, and it's chaired by Dr. Deanna Bianchi, who's the director of the Child Health Institute. So the MDCC has members that are representing 4 of the NIH institutes, 8 other federal agencies, including the Food and Drug Administration, the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, the Social Security Administration, and the Department of Defense. We also have 6 committee members representing patient advocacy groups, including PPMD and the Muscular Dystrophy Association. And our committee meets twice a year to discuss topics that are not only about research, but also patient care and access to services. So we've had recent meetings about newborn screening, about patient-reported outcome measures, about delay in diagnosis and other topics. And our meetings are open to the public, and you can watch them live online or access the recorded videos. And for more information, I encourage people to go to our website, which is mdcc.nih.gov. So one of the important products of the MDCC is called the Action Plan for the Muscular Dystrophy, which is a document describing currently about 81 long-term research objectives and goals. And they fit into categories such as understanding disease mechanisms, therapy development, clinical studies, research infrastructure, and resources and service for people who are living with the muscular dystrophies. So the goal of the document is really to keep stakeholders on the same page regarding needs and opportunities. So we first developed the action plan. Really, it was John that led the development of the first action plan in 2005. And then we revised the action plan in 2015 with input both times from really a wide range of experts and including patients and families. So the action plan itself and a link to the scientific journal publication about the action plan is also available on our website.
That's great. And John, given your role with MDCC and the action plan, anything you want to add to that?
Glenn did a nice job of describing it, just to emphasize the point that was really about coordination. It was about people understanding the gaps that were there that would potentially block the development of a drug, an effective drug. And that whether those gaps were early in the pipeline, early discovery stages, or whether they were late around clinical trials and drug approvals, they could be just as devastating to preventing the development of a drug. So getting everyone on the same page to help address those problems, I think, was a major achievement of the two action plans.
Yeah, it really does come down to collaboration. I'm sorry, Anne, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that, because when I was at FDA, I actually did sit on the committee as well, and I thought it was incredibly effective for bringing the messages regarding muscular dystrophy back to FDA. This coordination between the federal agencies is vital.
That's great.
Yeah, I'd love for you to talk about collaborations. I think long ago when my boys were diagnosed, one of the concerns was that people weren't collaborating. So one of the rules, if you will, or one of the mandates of the Wellstone Centers is collaboration. So can you talk to us about how that collaboration is within the academia, in the academics, in terms of across those centers, as well as two federal agencies like the FDA? How does all that mix together? So I'll start with you, Glenn.
Okay, so yeah, when we first designed the Wellstone Center program, we wanted to make sure that one of the goals of these centers of excellence, as they're called, is to promote not only excellent research, but also collaborations within the centers and collaborations with the researchers at the centers and other people in the muscular dystrophy field, collaborations between different centers. And so we put some features into the program to kind of ensure that. So one of the features is that each of the Wellstone centers is required to have a shared core facility that provides either services or research resources that are available to anyone in the muscular dystrophy community. So, for example, the center led by Lee Sweeney at the University of Florida has a core facility for doing physiologic testing in animal models. It's been very successful. So there's lots of examples of that where the Wellstone Centers have been kind of focal points of collaboration across the muscular dystrophies.
Thank you. And John, can you give us a good example of one of your experiences in encouraging collaboration?
Yeah, I think the Wellstone Centers leveraged other things. So I just looked at a list I pulled up of the translational research grants that were funded. This is nuts and bolts drug discovery, okay? That were funded over a several-year period during kind of a growth phase of therapy development at the NIH. And nearly all the large funded translational research grants were to someone that was affiliated with a Wellstone Center, and they really branched out. And through those, it really helped form partnerships with industry. So either the academic learned about drug development as they moved their translational program forward and formed spin-off companies, or they partnered with an existing company to move things forward, such as Jerry Mendel's large translational grant, $10 million NIH translational grant, turned into the collaboration with Sarepta on their gene therapy program. So I think that's a pretty effective leverage right there. You guys put money into it too. Other advocacy groups put money into it. So it's partnership and leverage are my two buzzwords.
Yeah, John, I couldn't agree with you more. It's partnership and leverage. No one single voice person, foundation, NIH Institute does it alone, right? It's all about our collective voice to drive therapy forward and certainly deliver therapies to all of those young men and some women that we love. And from the FDA point of view, if you had it to kind of dream about, how do you interact with the NIH? How do you interact with these grants? How do you know about them, and what do you do with them?
So where FDA really traditionally would get involved would be right about the time that a drug developer or sponsor was going into human trials. So I think, as I tried to show with the iceberg metaphor, there's an awful lot that's going on much before that. And especially, I think with a lot of these very novel therapeutic approaches that are targeting down to exon or intron defined changes. So these are all things that FDA hadn't had a lot of experience for. So getting that advance notice, having scientific experts that they could go to, hearing from the patient community early on, and then being familiar with the flexibility that they could yield in rare disease review. I think all of that has just been tremendously helpful. I think, as John mentioned, there hadn't been a lot going on in Duchenne, and it wasn't something that was on particularly the neurologic division's radar for quite some time. So I think all of these things that I've mentioned have just been extremely useful in getting everyone up to speed, increasing that dialogue with the community, but also with the researchers, and really understanding the issues.
Yeah, I'm reminded about NCATS helped select or funded Sarepta to really look at the first sequence for the first exon skipping drug. And then as things came forward, John and Glenn, I know you were involved in the question about, well, how do we quantify dystrophin? What are the methodologies? So can you talk a little bit about that day when we were all with the FDA and there were all those questions about what does it mean when it's expressed? How do we quantify it? And how will we know that that's important? Who wants to go first? John?
Yeah, so I can start. The NIH FDA dystrophin workshop, I think it was early in the year in 2015. Do I have that approximate time frame?
That's right.
And the big problem is all the companies that were their drugs were their candidate therapeutics, let me call them that, were targeted toward increasing dystrophin. They had problems quantifying dystrophin. So whether you use technologies that I'm sure the listeners have heard about, immunocytochemistry, Western blot that you saw in the approval meetings with the FDA, the advisory committee meetings, that it's hard to quantify a protein like that. Particularly when you're talking about low expression levels, which is what we're dealing with there. So what that meeting did is it shared in an open forum, and people were really open. So to me, there was, without self-interest or putting competition aside a little bit, they shared how they were going about measuring dystrophin and what the errors were, what the positive takeaways from their method of measurement was, and that set the field up to really evolve forward. Is the ultimate goal, right? Is ultimately to have this as a biomarker, so that you can do a clinical trial in Duchenne and have a pretty good idea whether you're affecting the initial target, which is increasing dystrophin for a lot of the trials, whether you're affecting that early. And that's a huge deal for companies and ultimately for approval, that you figure that out early. So those were my big takeaways from that conference, Pat. And I enjoyed participating in it with you. I think we were both on panels there. So
we were. Yeah. Glenn, your view on that meeting?
Yeah, I mean, that was I think really an excellent example of, the FDA demonstrating, their enthusiasm for the Duchenne field and for, helping to kind of educate the field better about best practices in drug development. So, they reached out to me to help organize and co-chair that meeting. And it was, I think, hopefully really helpful for the field to develop the types of, rigorous, accurate assays in order to, make go, no go decisions about therapy development.
Could I also go back in time even a little bit farther? I think it was in 2012 where we sponsored another meeting with John's office, and it was looking also at clinical outcomes and natural history studies and registries, and how do we prepare ourselves for the clinical trials that are coming down the line. So I remember that also being a very fruitful dialogue between FDA and the investigators about here are some of the things you're going to need when you're ready to go into the clinic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And Ian, Ryan, if I could jump in a second. So, Ian, you just reminded me of the meeting that you and I did together when you were at FDA on antisense oligonucleotide therapeutics, where we looked across different diseases. And the idea, Duchenne certainly was the major player. The idea was to learn from what was happening in different rare disorders in development of antisense oligonucleotide drugs.
Yeah, and actually staying on a bit on that topic of exon skipping drugs, we've seen approvals in exon skipping, thankfully, and we're grateful for that, and one for inflammation with a steroid. But we've also seen a lot of drug failures. And I think the community is learning about drug development. They understand that there's testing done on animals, and those may look encouraging, but then may not actually bear out when it comes to clinical testing. Can you talk a bit about NIH's role with the preclinical testing for these drugs, and why or why not we are seeing the things in the results in the clinic? I know it's a tough one, and I don't know who wants to take it first.
Glenn, you want to take a shot?
Okay, so I think Duchenne has been a really exciting research area because of all of the ingenuity from investigators coming up with different strategies to fix dystrophin gene, replace it, address downstream factors. And I think, like any other disease area, we realize some of the limitations in therapy development, limitations in, what the animal models can do for us, limitations in the knowledge of investigators and how to, proceed with this rigorous and well-designed preclinical translation studies. So, I think it has been a little bit of kind of growing pains, but one of the things that NINDS has done is to really try to emphasize with all of our grantees the need for addressing scientific rigor in the research and transparency, make sure that people describe how their studies are blinded, randomized, using appropriate statistical methods and so forth, so that the findings are reliable for everybody. And then we've also built really quite a broad preclinical translation program for all neurological and neuromuscular diseases at NINDS that supports everything from proof of concept, animal efficacy studies, all the way up through IND and first-in-human clinical trials.
John?
Yeah, I think the word innovation plays a big part of it. The field has been innovative in the targets they've looked at and in the strategies they've used, whether it's exon skipping or immunosuppression, or with some novel agents like the NF-kappa B inhibitors. And that means high risk. Okay, when you go after very innovative targets using innovative strategies, it's a lot of innovation, and that makes it high risk. The other issue I think that we're going to get into, or maybe should jump into now, is the delivery issue. So with antisense oligonucleotides and with gene therapy, it's not particularly easy to deliver those agents to the target tissue, to the muscle, and get them there in a large enough amount that they're effective. So a term that the industry uses called bioavailability or accessibility to the tissue. Now, I know some people point to the success in SMA, where oligotherapies and gene therapies have had tremendous success. They actually solved the delivery problem pretty easy, getting their agents into cerebral spinal fluid, which is right next to the brain and spinal cord where they needed to treat. So it got in fairly easily. We're using the same technologies, but we have the delivery problem with this field, and we've got to facilitate the uptake by muscle. And you're seeing a lot of innovation there, and that's nothing but good. We hope that oligos get more and more effective because they're delivered more effectively. We hope gene therapy gets delivered more effectively because for one thing, it's a very expensive reagent. You can only put so much in the body because of toxicity issues. So it's got to be taken up more effectively. And it's good we've got competing groups that are working on that.
Yeah, thank you, John. And Anne, from the FDA point of view and from your Office of Rare Disease point of view, what a difficult moment you have to really assess these therapies, and truly in a progressive disease that has progressive decline over a period of years, right? In SMA, they did have an advantage. Not that SMA1 is a good disease at all, but it's a very rapidly progressing disease in SMA1. In Duchenne, it's much more difficult. So how do you think about that? How do you assess when sometimes a clinical trial is a year, and that might not be enough time? Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's where the biomarker issue really came up, and the collaboration between NIH and FDA about we really do need better biomarkers. 1 year is just not going to be long enough to really be able to measure a clinical response in a lot of our patients. And as with every genetic disease, the difference from patient to patient is big. They're genetic diseases. Some people progress faster than others, but if you can measure those biochemical markers, so getting a better handle on that, what is a clinically meaningful change, and things like your MRI project, where we can start to see these effects in muscle and tissue much earlier. I think those have been just incredibly important areas.
Yeah, I do as well. Can I ask what do you think we could do next to move this field faster? I think for every parent, time matters, right? Days matter, months matter, and they have, obviously, we see meaningful changes and decline in muscle. What could we do? What do you see as the future, or what do you wish could happen as rapidly as possible to advance the field? I'm going to start with you, John.
Toughest question yet, right? I'd like to see more crosstalk among drug developers, to tell you the truth, because too often, like the failures, the information gets sequestered. And that may be the worst time to have the information sequestered. So I think the patients, it's your data, it's your data. So I think I'd insist on that there being more sharing of data. Sure, there's competition. Sure, there's information that has to be proprietary to a given drug developer, but I think that goes a lot further than it needs to. I think for me the answer is information, Pat, in that it's shared.
From your lips, John, to God's ears, I think data sharing is critically important. I worry about the contemporary natural history, because happy that these interdisciplinary teams are using medical tools, cardiac drugs, and so on, and changing the natural history. My sons were off their feet at 9. Now, mean age of loss of ambulation is later than that by years, right? Because of the use of steroids and probably other factors in terms of nutrition, weight restriction, physical therapy. There's lots of other factors that change the natural history. So from your lips, I think data sharing, I'd love for the FDA to share their data, obviously in a restricted place, so that we could all learn, that those who are developing drugs could learn from it. But I totally agree on that. Glenn, what about you?
Well, Pat, I think like the rest of the field, I sincerely hope that, we do have breakthroughs in Duchenne, like we've had for SMA in the very near future with gene therapy or other approaches. But I think what we still need is basic research to understand things like the immune response to gene therapy, or just the cellular immunity and how it works in disease pathology. So hopefully emerging new treatments will be dramatic breakthroughs and have young DMD boys up and walking. But oftentimes what fields find is that the first generation treatments are significant advances, but may not be complete cures. And then you have a whole new natural history that you have to understand. So I think, again, basic clinical studies to understand, how patients are progressing, even with the treatments that are available, and how to figure out second generation and third generation treatments, that do allow patients to do everything that they want to.
Good, thank you. And Anne?
Well, completely agree with what Glenn and John both said, but to take that data sharing one step farther, what I'd really like to see is not just sharing the data, but collaborating in clinical development. And I think we have a lot to learn here from the oncology space with these master protocols. And can we test more than one agent at the same time? Can we share placebo groups or historical placebo groups as a comparator? Can we get the different industry partners to participate in this one protocol or a master protocol or this durable infrastructure, so we aren't building up and then tearing down over and over again, but rather having that infrastructure exist and you can drop different diseases in? I think that would save a lot of time. And it would make the most of the resources that we do have, and would help us learn more in real time. So this is being done in the cancer space. So, it's not easily done, but it can be done.
So because we're on the data sharing topic, one question that does come up is, so if there is government funding for a study, say it's natural history or other, to an institution, is there a requirement put in that they have to share that data openly, or is it left up to the institution? To just clarify that, and I don't know who wants to take that one or start.
Well, I'll start. It's there is a requirement within the past few years. There was a congressional mandate that if this is NIH-funded research, then the data has to be shared. It was very vague on the details, though. So how exactly to share hasn't totally been worked out with, although recently NIH did come out with a very extensive guidance trying to put some parameters around that.
Thank you, Anne. John? Glenn?
Well, so actually, just to, I think, to bring this back to the action plan, bring this back to the MD Care Act, is I just checked my memory, and in the action plan, we have master trial agreements. So back in 2015, actually, we had the meeting in 2014, meetings in 2014 before I left NINDS. It was proposed that we move toward master trial agreements. So good call.
Yeah.
Glenn?
Yeah, all grant applications, have to have a data sharing plan with them. I think that academic investigators, they certainly want to make sure that the findings that they have the most impact on the field. They also, I think in some ways, may feel like their data is their treasure chest, and it gives them a competitive advantage. But I think we've certainly seen a willingness from industry to share a lot of their data through the Drisk program and other ways. So I think that the field is coming around to how sharing data does kind of float all boats, and people can still maintain their competitive advantage while sharing resources and data.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn, and thank you for mentioning Drisk, the Drisk consortium. This is a consortium. There are two in Duchenne. One is Drisk and the other is CTAP. Drisk is a consortium with the Critical Path Institute, and it's designed to share data sets, to integrate those data sets, put them in very specific language so they can be integrated and so people can learn from it. So there are members of that consortium, and I'm happy to say when John was with PPMD just after his retirement, he really facilitated the Drisk consortium, and it's moving along quite well, and it works directly with FDA. And to your comment about master protocols, we've been working for the last few years on a master protocol. We teamed up with IACT for Children, and we do have a meeting coming up about that protocol that is now finalized. So, we're hopeful, and I don't disagree that it certainly would be a way to facilitate some trials, certainly make them more inclusive, and hopefully utilize a smaller sample for placebo. One last, really quick, did COVID delay everything? Are we years behind, months behind, or hopefully not very behind? And we'll start with you, Glenn, go to Anne, and then John.
Well, in the, I monitor progress on grants in my portfolio, and I've certainly seen progress reports from a number of investigators in the past few months that indicate, the impact that COVID has had on shutting down their research programs. Many are, kind of just now getting back to where they can have some of the lab members working in the lab at the same time, but still maintaining social distancing. So yes, I think this really has had a significant effect, and hopefully, the resiliency of the research workforce can bounce back and make up for this lost time.
Thank you. Anne?
Yes, similar observations to Glenn, but also on the patient side, many of our patients are medically fragile, and it was difficult for them to go out and access either routine care or to participate in some of these studies. So it did have somewhat of a slowing effect. People are really getting back into it now. But on the other side, I think the remote capture and participation, telemedicine, but also hopefully now trying to remote capture more data, we hope that will have a facilitating effect as we go forward.
Thank you, Anne. And John?
First disclaimer is that I haven't been a federal employee for 5 years now, but I still facilitate in the way that Glenn facilitates. So actually, I have a call tomorrow talking with an investigator about the research grant application to give them advice just based on my experience with NIH. But I'll tell you, that really, to me, is the nexus. I worry about the junior investigators, the people that can't go to the scientific conferences and have the face-to-face interactions to make and expand on contacts, potential collaborators, and everything. So during this time when we're all shut up, hopefully not too much longer with the vaccines coming out, I worry the most about the junior investigators and how they're going to come through this.
That makes sense. First of all, you are all wonderful. I am so glad you're in our ecosystem. I can't thank you enough for participating in this panel and taking time out of your schedule. This has been really wonderful. We hope to see you again soon. We're going to acknowledge this whole year, so we're going to call you back and bring you back on so that we can talk more. But thank you so much for joining us. It's just a pleasure always seeing you. And I agree with you, John and Glenn and Anne. I hope the world opens. I hope these junior investigators find people to connect with, learn more, and derive more research, because we need therapies for Duchenne and for so many other diseases. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you
Again,
all.
you're wonderful, and we
Great to be
appreciate
with you.
you.
Take
Yeah.
care.
All right.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. Now, I have to say, I'm thrilled to talk to you about a new congressional champion who's agreed to be the Republican lead of the Duchenne funding letter. And he happens to be from Ohio. So he lives around, his district is around Nationwide Children's, a place near and dear to all of our hearts. And so let's hear from Congressman Stephen Stivers, who has a message for our community.
Hi, I'm Congressman Steve Stivers, and for years I've been working with my colleagues of both sides of the aisle to fight for more rare disease research. We've got to expand and accelerate that research. Families nationwide are counting on us to help treat and overcome their illnesses. Right now, there are almost 15,000 young Americans living with a rare disease known as Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And as co-chair of the Congressional Biomedical Research Caucus, I'll work with Republicans and Democrats to make sure that we continue to fund and expand life-saving research. I want to thank all the partners involved with the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy and all others working day in and day out to end Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It's an honor to represent Ohio and the people of the 15th District, and I want to continue to work with you in the new Congress to make sure that we can expand important things like biomedical research.
We are absolutely thrilled about Congressman Stivers joining the letter. Our next message is from Democratic lead for our funding letter and longtime champion, Congresswoman Doris Matsui. She and Rep. Stivers will be leading the bipartisan letter in the House to ensure federal funding. Here now is a message from Congresswoman Doris Matsui.
Hi, everyone. It is wonderful to join you virtually today for this 20th anniversary of PPMD's Advocacy in Action event. I want to begin by thanking all of you for your tireless efforts advocating for the Duchenne community and fighting for a cure to this devastating disease. All of us here share a common bond, whether as family members, caregivers, or friends. Our lives have been forever changed by this disease. Duchenne takes so much from young people and their families. And while we have made progress with innovative treatments and therapies to slow its progression, we are still working towards an ultimate cure. However, there is tremendous reason for hope that a cure is on the horizon, due in large part to your advocacy and Congress's support for Duchenne research and therapy development. The work each of you do, raising awareness, advocating for federal support, and advancing research is truly life-changing for so many families. And that is why I'm so proud to join you. I will continue to do everything that I can to fight alongside you, to share your stories, and to be your champion in Congress for increasing federal funding for Duchenne research and an urgent investment we need to improve treatment and to find a cure for the disease. It is with this knowledge what we can create a robust future for how we manage, treat, and improve the lives of Duchenne individuals and families. This past year has been unlike any other, and it is a testament to the resolve of groups like yours that we continue to move forward and stay engaged on the causes that matter the most. Thank you for all that you do for this community. Each one of you provides a beacon of hope for your loved ones and friends as they face the unimaginably difficult circumstances brought on by this disease. Every patient, every advocate, and every member of the support system shows courage, shows resolve, and moves the needle forward. My message to you is simple. Keep it up. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for bringing your positive energy. Together, we can defeat this disease. Thank you all so much for everything you do. And please Stay safe.
You heard the Congresswoman. Keep it up. I think that's an important message. You know, Duchenne and Becker families are the driving force and the reason for the results we see in advocacy in Duchenne. Your voice, your stories have made all the difference, convincing those who represent you in Congress that Duchenne matters and that we should sustain research at the federal level. And we advocate with one shared purpose, one common goal to end Duchenne. Let's now hear from some of those families.
I advocate because the policymakers need to hear real experience, strength, and hope from the families that those policies are going to impact the most.
I advocate because I hope that my experience will help drive our representatives to pass policies and laws that will improve my well-being and others like me.
I advocate because my voice, along with every member in the community, is crucial in convincing funders, researchers, and regulators to make Duchenne muscular dystrophy research a priority, leading to improved outcomes for all affected.
We advocate because we care about our family and all families affected by Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
I advocate because I'm not a researcher or a scientist, but I'm a mother with a voice and a story to share.
My hope is that all patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy have access to life-saving drugs to extend their lives, no matter what their genetic mutation is.
My hope is that there will be a treatment for all patients with Duchenne, regardless of their age, the young and the old.
My hope is that one day we will have effective treatments to end Duchenne.
My hope is that one day, for every Duchenne diagnosis that a family receives, that they will have options for treatment for their child.
My hope is that the successes of the past 20 years will lead more and more people to advocate on behalf of our sons and our community, and that's what's going to lead to success in the future.
My hope is that our voices are heard and they drive our mission of ending Duchenne.
"20 years ago, we first went to the Center for Disease Control. Now, so many times we think of the Center for Disease Control as looking at the public health, and indeed it does. And our first interaction was with the director of the Center for Disease Control, Julie Gerberding. So we're going to hear from Julie now.
Hi, I'm Julie Gerberding, the Chief Patient Officer at Merck and an Executive Vice President, but also the former Director of the US CDC. And I'm so pleased to be a part of the celebration of 20 years of landmark legislation through the MD Care Act. And when I was at CDC, I learned how important investing in the kinds of surveillance, research, and quality assurance efforts that this act allowed. In a sense, the efforts for muscular dystrophy are a microcosm of the whole world of rare diseases. And I think what we've learned and the successes that we've had so far really can inform broader programs going forward. A lot has happened in 20 years. At CDC, there have been incredible investments in partnerships across the states to improve the surveillance for Duchenne's, to improve our ability to understand the issues and the circumstances that families that are coping with this disease are facing, and overall the quality of care, but also the impact of the medical progress that has been made. The fact that survival has increased by a decade over this period of time is not attributable to new medicines. It's attributable to better understanding of the disease and better systems of care. So thank you for everything that you're doing. I think this is proof of concept that advocacy really matters, but also convening people across a variety of sectors to focus on an important problem and really move the needle on the dial gives us hope that we can do the same for many other conditions. So thank you.
It was so good to hear from Dr. Gerberding. She's been really such an advocate for us in CDC, and we were so sad to see her leave, but she's in Merck Pharmaceuticals now and doing very well. So glad to hear from her. Let's talk about the Center for Disease Control. Please list the slides. The Center for Disease Control is indeed about the public health, and that's how we think about the CDC, especially in this time of panic when they're helping us with vaccines and vaccine distribution, but they're also interested in children. So there's a center there, next slide please, that is the National Center of Birth Defects and Developmental Disabilities. Again, an acronym, the NCBDDD. This focuses on 3 areas: improving care and services, conducting public health research, and collaborating with partners. So when the Muscular Dystrophy Care Act was passed, one of our immediate partners was the Center for Disease Control. Next slide, please. When we think about what did they do and how has this been over the last 20 years, 20 years ago, we really didn't know the incidence and prevalence of the disease. We didn't know how many people were born with Duchenne and diagnosed. We didn't know how many people were living with Duchenne in the United States, or for that matter, around the world. So as the CDC program started up, they started looking at tracking and figuring out the incidence and prevalence of this disease. So this tracking network became known as the MD StarNet. The MD StarNet is located in seven different areas, and it really is looking at the incidence and prevalence. There are many publications out of MD StarNet. It really is an amazing collaboration for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. As we began to grasp the StarNet data, we thought about how to improve care, and the CDC, with an international group of people, took on the development of care considerations, or sort of in our framework as parents and advocates, it's called standards of care. There's certain evidence generation that you have to have for standards, so these are called care considerations. The care considerations were published in Lancet in 2019 and then updated in 2018. And in 2018, based on the changes that we've seen in terms of implementing good care across, we saw a 10-year difference in the mean age of death in this disease. So these young men were growing older and getting bigger and walking longer, and we were thrilled to see this. CDC is also focusing on improving diagnosis. How do you improve the diagnosis? By diagnosing these children earlier. So one of the ways they collaborated was to the development of childmuscleweakness.org. And this is a website that's full of snippets of information about how to diagnose early symptoms of the muscular dystrophies, and certainly in particular Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So we are thrilled to have with us today a group from CDC. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about the change that we've seen. In 2001, the Center for Disease Control had essentially zero investment in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, or in fact in muscular dystrophy. But when we look across and see the dramatic increase in this investment, now to $107 million since 2001, and as Mr. Wicker mentioned in his letter, another $6 million to the Center for Disease Control, their impact has been significant. And I'm really happy to say today we have a panel from the CDC. Some of our partners from CDC are there, as well as a neurologist who is delivering care and using the tools that have been developed by the Center for Disease Control and collaborators and implementing them in her clinic in Delaware. So with that, I'd like to introduce members of our panel today. Natalie Street. Natalie is a health scientist at the National Center of Birth Defects and Developmental Disabilities. Catherine Riley is the team lead at the NCBDDD. And Mayna Scavina, Dr. Mayna Scavina, leads the Nemours Clinic in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Welcome, everyone, and we're so glad that you could join us today. I'd like, first of all, for you to introduce yourselves. I gave obviously a very brief introduction, so we're going to start there so our guests know you, and so all the advocates see face-to-face what you've done and who you are. So I'm going to start with you, Natalie. Please introduce yourself.
Hey, hi. My name is Natalie Street, and as Pat said, I'm a health scientist at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And I'm on the Rare Disorders and Health Outcomes team, which is the team that has the muscular dystrophy activities. And I've been with the team now for about 15 years. I started off working with clinicians Jerry Mendel in particular, on the newborn screening pilot in Ohio. Then I also started at that point, after that project was wrapping up, with MD StarNet. And we'll talk more about that, but that's, as Pat had mentioned, that's our surveillance and research program. And then have also been involved in coordinating and getting the care considerations updated recently, as well as some of the early diagnosis projects. So.
Thank you, Natalie. And Catherine.
Hi, good afternoon. First, just wanted to say thank you so much to PPMD for inviting us to share information with you today as part of this event. I'm really happy to be here today. I've been able to work on genetic and rare conditions throughout my career in academia, at a state health department setting, both in a newborn screening program and a state genetic services program, and at the federal level, both at the Health Resources and Services Administration, where I participated on the MDCC that you heard about earlier on the NIH panel, and with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So I currently have the honor of leading the Rare Disorders and Health Outcomes team at CDC, which, like you mentioned, is where the muscular dystrophy work is situated.
Thank you, Catherine. And Dr. Scavina.
Hello, thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Maina Scavina. I'm a neurologist at Nemours DuPont Hospital for Children in Wilmington, Delaware. I've been here about 25 years between attending and my training. We are a certified Duchenne care center and an MDA care center as well. We have a wonderful team that provides care to boys and families with Duchenne. And so it's just an honor to be here, to be invited. I said to Pat and Ryan that I remember going to the hearings in 2001 with my small children in strollers and taking the train from Wilmington, because I think we all understood that it would be a significant impact on the community, and it has been.
Thank you, Maina. It certainly has been an impact on the community, and I remember that hearing so very well. It was a moment, wasn't it, when it seemed like the world stood still and talked about Duchenne and other muscular dystrophies. So let's talk about what the impact has been. And Natalie, you certainly have been instrumental in that, in the change of lifespan. Can you give us a little, you've been here 15 years. Can you tell us what occurred and what you saw happen in this space?
Sure, yeah. I joined back, I think, in 2005 or 6. And at that point, the muscular dystrophy program was very young. And we were still learning about, what barriers there were to early diagnosis. And so we were really focused on learning about those, as well as determining what we could do in that area. And at that time, I started to get involved in the newborn screening pilot that was being done in Ohio with Jerry Mendel. And there was also a pilot that was at Emory University looking at whether screening could be done at about a year of life and seeing whether or not either one of those could be something that we could do to really impact whether or not somebody was diagnosed early. And then those are really good studies that the current pilot has built upon, that's in New York. And from there, we looked at data that has been coming out on muscular dystrophy through MD StarNet. And so we could see what kind of care people were receiving, and also what types of factors were impacting survival over time. And so we could also then look to the care standards, and we recognized that there was really a need for some comprehensive care and not just fragmented care. And so in around 2008, there was talk about developing those. And in 2010, the original care considerations were published. And I think that really set the stage for providing the guidance that everyone needed to be able to get good care for everybody that has Duchenne muscular dystrophy, not just in the US, but across the world. And so I think that had a really big impact then on the care and the improvement in care, and also, in effect, then the lifespan of people that are living with Duchenne.
Yeah, and Maina, you have experienced it firsthand treating patients. Could you comment on what you've seen because of the care considerations and how you care for your own patients?
Yeah, I was thinking about it, and not to simplify things, but almost as a roadmap, these care considerations, like the apps we use to get to a certain destination. They alert us to roadblocks ahead, better ways perhaps of getting to where we want to be. And I think the care considerations tell us where we are in the disease itself, different specialties, and the things that we need to look at going forward. And in doing so, hopefully to improve the quality of lifespan, as well as decrease the impact of some of the things that, even if we do all the things, they still happen or may happen, but perhaps the impact and the effect on the child and the family is better than it would have been.
That's great.
That's great. And Catherine, talk to us about how you look at care considerations in the next. So we're already on the next iteration, right? How do you think through when do you do this again? When do you think of a next iteration of the care considerations? When would it be appropriate?
Sure, and kind of backing up to the development of the original care considerations in 2010, we think about that process, and CDC convened experts in 8 different working groups, and really using what was known in the literature at the time, and of course the expertise of all the experts that we gathered. And then these groups used the RAND appropriateness method to outline the recommended care that informed those original care considerations. As you can imagine, there was a lot of coordination of in-person meetings at different time points in this process. And then all of that led to revising or updating the care considerations in 2018. And so before we get to that next step of talking about what might be next, I was going to turn it over to Natalie. She was going to walk you through a little bit of about the updates in 2018.
That sounds fine. Natalie?
Yeah, sure. So in 2018, I think before this, there was a recognition that, of course, guidelines or care considerations do go out of date, but there were some things that could be added to improve care and also to really make sure that care was being made in a proactive way. And so in about 2015 or so, we decided to go down the road of updating the care considerations. And so we didn't have to go through quite as an extensive a process as with the original, because we already were working with the basic document, and a lot of that still applied. So we used the RAND method, we did literature reviews, we convened experts that had been involved before, as well as some new experts. We wanted to get new people involved. And so they convened around each topic area. So each of the original 8, plus 3 additional that were deemed very important. And that was bone health and endocrine, also transition of care, and also primary care and emergency care. And then across those topics, also really trying to add information for adult care, because that was something that was not a focus much of the 2010 care considerations. And so, it was a process. We convened everybody, and we're able to do a lot through email. Also held an in-person meeting to discuss the recommendations that were coming out of the literature, and then also supplementing that with expert opinion. And then those then created the basis for the 3 manuscripts that then came out in the Lancet Neurology in early 2018. And then something else I think that was a little bit different than before was there were a lot of recommendations that there wasn't a lot of maybe explanation behind. So each of the different groups were able to publish their own paper in a pediatric supplement later this year, so that we could understand more about some of the recommendations that are behind, say, cardiac care or respiratory care, and also even evaluating care. We also had a paper on that. And so there's more information, I think, than before about how to get the best care. And then we also worked with the American Academy of Pediatrics and the investigators that had been involved in the care considerations to develop 5 webinars that had continuing education credits attached to it, so that clinicians could also learn more about all the updates that had occurred. And so, we wanted it to get out more than I think we did in 2010. And so I think at each step of the way, like, with the original and then with this update, we're trying to learn more about, what's better care, but also try to get out the care more.
Yeah, and I think, and we were grateful to be part of the process on both, the 2010 and the 2018, our teams. We now have approved therapies. And I think that the next question is, so at what point do information about the fact that we have accelerated approved therapies and a full approval with the new steroid, do those get integrated into an eventual supplement or the next update? I know that these are questions that payers have and something that we've been discussing internally. So I would love comments on that if it's an okay question to ask. Who would like to start?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to start. A question came up recently with someone who has taken part in the gene therapy trial and is several years out now, and sort of where do we go from here? What kind of care do I receive? What should we be looking at? And both as a clinician and as a family, I think those are questions that if you're not directly involved in the clinical trial, it would be nice to have a guideline or a roadmap. I'm seeing children now who have been on some of the exon skipping therapies. What do we need to really be looking for? Tracking. What does that data look like long term? We talked about carriers in more detail recently, females with dystrophinopathy, and I think there could be a place for that since there was new information on their cardiac findings and their psychosocial aspect. The brain, although there's a psychosocial piece, perhaps more about what we've learned on Duchenne and the brain. Yeah. So I think there would be no lack of information for a new update for sure.
Yeah. Catherine, Natalie.
Yeah, I think that as we learn more, certainly as we gather more data, which we are trying to do currently, and as we gather more and we learn more about the condition, including new treatments and the evolution of treatments, certainly we need to revisit those and see if we need to update the consideration. So I think it's definitely something to always be keeping in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really remarkable where we are with active clinical trials and 4 approvals and more approvals perhaps on the way in gene therapies. I think one of the looming questions is how do we get to combinations? How and when, and what kind of guidance would you give if you had a child who received gene therapy and then became amenable to an exon skipping therapy once approved? How could we think about that, and how do we guide physicians to make those decisions? I think are really going to be challenges for all of us. And certainly, as Maina suggested, when a parent comes to her and says, what's next? I think in Duchenne, as parents, we always are looking at what's next. So love to hear your thoughts on how to manage or how to think, or if you're thinking about that now, as we now have 4 approvals and as I say, hopefully more in the near future. Anyone want to take that on?
I would like to, and I certainly don't want to take over the discussion, but what I'm seeing in a different disease entity in which there are some new therapies, which has been a little bit concerning, is that people, because we don't have comparative data, families are coming and saying, well, I've been reading a lot online from a certain group, and I think I'm going to switch to this medicine. Or I was thinking about this, but I heard something else on Facebook, and I think this is happening to me this week, where people are making decisions based on what others are saying on social media. And I'm taken aback because I feel that I should have more data or more to offer them. But the reality is I don't have those comparative studies. And so I think there's a huge need for that going forward.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments on that?
Yeah, I think that's what we're really missing right now is just what what are the effects of these new therapies on people that have Duchenne, and also what are the combined effects of people on Duchenne, or people with Duchenne on corticosteroids and some of these new drugs. And I think we need some studies to really see what happens, and that really forms the basis of what then you need to develop, care considerations. So I think some of those studies are really needed to move forward.
Yeah, and in the interim, PPMD is collecting data through our registry. CDC was an early funder of that project to get us sort of off the ground and running, and that registry has really expanded over 10 years. And I think that it's important for us to gather data from the patient experience directly from them, because they are willing to contribute that data, so we can provide it as well.
Yeah, it's always hard when you're in that middle part where you have an approval and you need to gather the data, and you know that it's time, right? And it's time against a disease that really takes time away. So I'm going to go back to MD Starnet for just a minute. I'd love for you to talk to us about the 7 sites. How were they chosen? Why were they chosen? Why not 50 sites? Granted, we can always talk about budgets, but what would be ideal in your view, and how do you see MD Starnet going into the future? Who wants to start?
Well, I guess I will start with that. I think it would be helpful to explain more about what MD Starnet is before I get back to why only 7 sites. As you know, with the passage of the MD Care Act, that provided for a national epidemiological system so that we could look at things like prevalence and public health questions around muscular dystrophies. And so in 2001, MD Starnet, or its Muscular Dystrophy Surveillance, Tracking, and Research Network, was started. And at that time, we were focusing on Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy, and we did so for the first 10 years of the system. Mm-hmm. MD Starnet does, we call it a population-based surveillance system for muscular dystrophy. And all that means is that within certain geographic areas, we are trying to find everybody that has a particular type of muscular dystrophy. So in this case, of course, it's Duchenne and Becker. And so we're trying to find out, identify everybody so that we can look at prevalence, but also we're collecting a lot of clinical data from primarily medical records, so that we can get a good picture of what it is, what the disease looks like within the whole population of people that have Duchenne and Becker. And so looking at the diagnosis and what kind of what contributes to diagnostic delay. And so for the first 10 years, again, we were focusing on Duchenne, and at around 2011, we expanded to other forms of muscular dystrophy too, but we really learned a lot, I think, in those first 10 years. It's like some of the things that we've learned, we've had a couple different prevalence papers come out. In fact, one just came out last month, and it basically confirmed the prevalence of about 1 in 5,000 across the different sites. Mm-hmm. It also confirmed a finding that we had in 2015, where it appears to be more prevalent in Hispanics and less prevalent in Blacks. And you could say maybe that's because they aren't seeking care. Maybe Black patients are not seeking care in the places that we're going to, but mortality studies have supported that it may be less prevalent. We've also been able to document the diagnostic odyssey. So there is about a 2.5-year lag between when first signs and symptoms appear and when somebody gets a final diagnosis at around age 5. Mm-hmm. And again, we found disparities in diagnosis with Black and Hispanics getting evaluated later and getting diagnosed later. And some other things have been looking at growth in people with Duchenne, so that we've had growth charts developed for people who are younger and ambulating and on or off steroids, and older children in their teenage years who are in a wheelchair and either on or not on steroids. And so there's been a better understanding of growth, also of corticosteroid trends. We see, of course, that the use of corticosteroids have been going up over the years. And also that corticosteroids, what type of an impact they have on the health of people with Duchenne, delaying the onset of cardiomyopathy by a couple years. So I think, those are examples of some of the things that have come out of MD StarNet. But I guess, getting back to why only 7 sites, to gather all this data, we have to actually go out to different clinic sources, such as neuromuscular clinics. We also get access to vital records from state health departments and hospital discharge data to try to find everywhere that somebody might be going to receive care. And it's very resource intensive to do that. It also, not all investigators have the infrastructure and the support, the public health authority to even do that. And so we get applicants every 5 years when we have a funding period and a funding announcement come out. But really there are maybe between 6 and 10 grantees that actually or applicants that will even be eligible to apply. It does require some infrastructure behind that. And so we would love to see more sites, but again, it's resource intensive and you have to be able to have a lot of collaborations with state health departments and universities to really do this well.
So thank you for that, Natalie. And maybe, Catherine, you could, or both of you could speak to the fact that as we're looking for disparities, or we're looking really to understand some of the disparities that you talked about in terms of the Hispanic or the Black population, do you target certain states where the population is more Hispanic, for instance, or more diverse, so that you can get a better and more comprehensive picture? Or how do you think about that?
When we put out a funding announcements, one of the things that we're really looking at is it's maybe a requirement even that they have to have a certain number of people within their site, so at least 3 million people that reside in their site, and they have to have a large proportion of a minority group to be able to apply. And so that is kind of a stipulation in the funding announcement that they're aware of, so that they can be sure to apply in a site that has a large minority population.
Good, thank you for that. I just didn't know how it worked out so that you could really get a fair representation. And then, last question about this: when you're looking at those 7 muscular dystrophy StarNet sites or MD StarNet sites, is there an algorithm you apply that you can get to that 1 in 5,000 number based on the population in the U.S. or based on the population data? How do you get to the 1 in 5,000 from a limited number of states?
That's a great question. And so we look at census data to determine the size of the population within a certain year in each of those sites. And we take the data that we have, the number of cases that we have, and we basically then calculate the prevalence, and it happens, of course, to be around 1 in 5,000. And in this between sites, it may be a little bit different, but that's the average that is across the sites. So there is a range, but that is the average.
Good.
And that's basically how we calculate it.
Catherine, I want to switch a bit here now to 2 kind of interrelated topics, and that's barriers to diagnosis and newborn screening. As you know, that PPMD is currently invested in a pilot in New York with newborn screening. When it comes to the average age of diagnosis, we haven't truly moved the needle beyond the age of around 4, isn't it, Pat? Around 4 years old. Although there's been efforts by CDC PPMD, in collaboration, we set up the task force. So I was wondering your thoughts about that, and then maybe you could talk a bit about, given your background too with HRSA, newborn screening and the importance of it.
Sure. So I'll start with some of the kind of barriers and things that we have tried to do to kind of address those barriers. So we have had, web-based tools, as you have mentioned before, Ryan, aimed at primary caregivers to really help better diagnose young children with muscle weakness, and also for parents and helping them to start a conversation with their pediatrician about concerns they have with motor development. But we really want to reach more clinicians and parents with this information and with these tools. So that's one way we can help address that. And we are looking at data from Muscular, the MD StarNet that you've heard a lot about, to see if the diagnostic milestones have changed since we first reported them in 2009. So that's something we can utilize the data that we're collecting to help inform that. And then, of course, we know some of the challenges that are experienced with individuals and families really are similar to challenges that we see across rare conditions. They can experience, that with limited knowledge about rare and genetic conditions among general practitioners, it can make it challenging to identify signs and symptoms. And there also may be limited awareness about risk and risk level, both from providers and for individuals and families. So looking at ways we can provide more information into the field, again, both for providers, but also for families. And then, of course, one of the tools we do have in public health for early identification is newborn screening. So Ryan, did you want me to talk just a little bit about what newborn screening is?
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful.
Okay, sure. So newborn screening is a population-based, state-mandated screening program. It's really designed to screen all babies born for a set of rare congenital conditions that, if undetected, can cause a disability or death. And the goal of newborn screening is to identify these infants that may be at risk for morbidity and mortality, so that we can implement appropriate treatments, interventions, or enhanced monitoring that can be implemented that can really improve outcomes for these affected infants. And so many of the conditions included in newborn screening panels can be life-threatening in the first week of life. It is important to recognize that newborn screening is more than a single test at one point in time. It's really a whole system. And newborn screening programs are primarily run out of state health departments, and they do this in collaboration and coordination with parents and hospitals and healthcare providers, couriers, laboratories, public health professionals, and of course, primary care providers and the specialists in the field that are going to treat the individuals that are identified with these conditions. There is a recommended uniform screening panel, or RUSP, if you've heard that term. That's a list of conditions that the Health and Human Services Secretary recommends that states screen as part of their state universal newborn screening programs. The RUSP currently consists of 35 core conditions and 26 secondary conditions. And the conditions on the RUSP are chosen based on evidence that supports the potential net benefit of screening, the ability of states to screen for the disorder, and the availability of effective treatments. So the Advisory Committee on Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children, or ACHDNC for short, reviews the evidence available for conditions and provides recommendations to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. The ACHDNC considers nominations, which are often submitted by a team of nominators from the field. And then they use an evidence-based review process and a decision matrix to really guide their decisions on whether to recommend a condition be added to the RUSP. So Ryan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, that's helpful. Pat?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. We were really thrilled about 18 months ago, maybe nearly 2 years by now, to launch newborn screening with New York State. So we are hopeful that we will be able to collect the evidence to submit to the RUSP in 2022. So we're, and this is based on Jerry Mandel's pilot that was in Ohio, and then going forward with New York State. So we took advantage of infrastructure used by the SMA community, and hopefully we will see that come to fruition. And hopefully in parallel, we will see more additional approvals as well. So we're really looking forward to that, and hope to see that in the future. I'm going to sort of go back to the care considerations, Mena. In 2018, they added on adult care right? And I think one of the really tragedies of our families, depending on what state they live in, is their particular academic center or hospital decides at a certain age, 18, 21, that they are no longer going to be cared for under that umbrella of care. So I'd love for you, Maina, to talk about your adults, what you do. Do you care for them? Do you send them somewhere else? And how is that care best managed?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's very difficult for many families who often have received the diagnosis at a particular institution, have been there their whole lifetime, and then often when things are changing for them, particularly, it's time to go to another institution, whole another set of providers. So it is a sensitive subject, but I think having a good transition program, we have a transition clinic with a physician and a social worker who we try to refer children to. There's various different ages, and we may put a consult in at 11, 12, 13, 14 to start the discussion about transitioning when they turn 21. That's as long as I can see them in our institution. But oftentimes they may not want to go until 18, when they know that it's imminent and they have to transition. But I think in our system, she provides a wonderful service in terms of really outlining for young adults things that they will be responsible for, who their providers will be, taking responsibility of their own care, and really things that are somewhat difficult for us to take part in our clinic visit when we're thinking about all these other care considerations. So I think having someone that is dedicated to the transition process. There are transition tools that clinics can use, social workers, others on the team that can help facilitate this. But it's really important because I think for someone to suddenly leave their pediatric home and not have something set up for the adult leaves this gap where it can be very dangerous and I think unsettling for a family. So starting discussions in the teen years, talking about responsibility, about this is something that will happen here. And then we have made connections with adult providers in our region that we can contact to say, this individual is transitioning. Can you help us facilitate an appointment for them, check their insurance and so on. So there's a smooth transition of power, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so that an appointment is made, hopefully before they have to leave, so that they can make sure that they're comfortable there, that the records are all there, that if there is an issue, they can go to an adult hospital if they need emergency care. So those are things that we try to do, but it is not a perfect system. And there are some centers that are able to follow individuals through adult life. And so the situation is different in those centers than it is for those of us that are freestanding pediatric. But it's an important topic. And I think it's become something that individuals are more apt to understand and be very grateful for when they've actually seen a transition specialist, if you will, that can give them tips that we have not perhaps and really make it a smoother process.
Yeah, it's difficult no matter how you look at it. I know as we began the Certified Duchenne Care Center program, we have 28 certified Duchenne care centers, and we have 2 adult care centers. But I do know in the community, just the transition, because when you build trust with a team and then you turn a certain age and you need to go to this next team, right? I know that families falter a great deal about how that's done and when that's done. I also want to just raise one other issue of the care considerations, and I'd love all of your thoughts on that. In the care considerations, it talks about bone health, and in the 2018, certainly endocrine was one of the predominant features, or certainly an important feature of the 2018 care considerations. In that, the recommendation is to treat after the first fracture, and I think just sort of the question parents ask is, can't we prevent the first fracture? And how do we bridge that? And I understand it's evidence, but how can we think about that particular issue in endocrinology, about what do we measure? How do we measure it? What does it mean? And how can we think through when to start oral or IV bisphosphonates? So, Maina, I'm going to start with you about how you deal with this, what you're looking at, and then ask Catherine and Natalie to take it forward to when it could change.
Yeah, so I think having a multidisciplinary team all together in clinic. So next to me is the orthopedist, and I will say, you know, what do we think here? This child already has on a lateral x-ray a vertebral fracture. And then we have a whole discussion, and they're seeing endocrinology earlier than they were before. Vitamin D levels are checked more regularly. These are all, I think, from the care considerations that have brought them to the forefront to do these things. And then the endocrinologist will look at all the data, at least in our institution. It may be different for different institutions, but have that discussion with the family on steroid use, vitamin D, when do we escalate to the next therapy, and monitoring bone density scans or DEXA scans were somewhat tricky in the younger population. So recommendations to do lateral x-rays to look at the bone density has been very important. And, you know, as a generalization, again, for what I see is that these care considerations, if we try to go back to them and adhere to them as a group, brings these issues to the forefront, hopefully to stop that first fracture from happening, to have them see an endocrinologist earlier on, and to have those discussions. Mm-hmm. As well as having a dietitian in clinic with you, discussing diet. You know, so many aspects of this that are important. And that's what I think those considerations bring to clinic.
I agree. They've just been incredible. Catherine and Natalie, welcome thoughts on what happens after this and when we can see the 2020 something care considerations. We'll start with Catherine and then go to you, Natalie, for the last word.
We put you on the spot, but yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Well, I'll just kind of say in general, I mean, I hope that we can use the MD StarNet data that we're gathering to really help us to describe whether patients are getting the recommended care. We know that studying the impact of care considerations is challenging, but we really are looking into ways that we can assess these impacts. And so I think if we can utilize the data to better describe the population and maybe help us determine some of the factors that are leading up to the events. So really utilizing the data in that way, I think can be really helpful. I don't know if we can pinpoint an exact year, the next update. I think we let the data and the evolution of the findings sort of direct that. But Natalie, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that again, the care considerations are meant to be proactive, and I think they do a pretty good job of trying to prevent rather than to treat something that could have been prevented. But again, we need to find out what is the care that people are receiving? When are they receiving it? And can they what happens if they receive medication earlier? Does that prevent then some future problems, or at least delay them? And so I think, again, like Catherine is saying, I think we can use the data that we have from MD StarNet and from registries to see, what does the care picture look like, and help that inform some of the gaps, and then take those and use those to update the care.
Yeah, and I think you hit it on the head, is really focusing on some of those gaps rather than waiting for the next huge update. We want to make sure to take on some of these gaps together collaboratively with you and our certified care network to see if we can really advance those areas. So we can't thank you enough for this wonderful panel. We will be coming back to you later on this year. We're going to be doing a series of webinars, and Natalie has agreed and Catherine has agreed to do a deeper dive into some of these topics. But we're grateful to all of you. Pat?
Thank you. We are so grateful that you're in our ecosystem. We've been so blessed to have you as federal partners in MENA. We think the world of your clinic and all you do for us, and certainly emphasize carriers and how we can best treat the hearts of those carriers should they need treating and they need evaluating. And certainly for our boys, their hearts are a muscle too, and that has to be front and center. So thank you all for joining us today. This has been wonderful. Thank you for being part of these 20 years of success. We still have ways to go, but we know you're on the way with us. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for all you guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So Our next speaker is a message from a dear friend of ours, dear friend of our communities, Annie Kennedy, who's Chief of Policy and Advocacy at the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. Annie has a long history with this community. She's been advocating for the Duchenne community for most of her life. We consider her a true friend across this entire community, and we're grateful to have her message. Here's Annie Kennedy.
So the MD Care Act to me, February 27th, 2001, I vividly remember we were in the Hart Senate office building for the first MD Care Act Senate hearing. And so much about that day is etched on my heart forever. Hearing Pat speak for the first time, watching my young friend Ben Cumbo bring the room to a standing ovation, seeing the Senate focus on muscular dystrophy for the very first time in history. But what really changed forever that day and stands out the most to me was the power of our community as we came together for the very first time. Families, kids, young adults, clinicians, researchers, volunteers, grandparents, everyone showed up for one another. So much so that the hearing room overflowed. And as Senator Spector began the hearing, he interrupted Dr. Audrey Penn, who at the time was the acting director of NINDS, the National Institutes of Health. And he said that he understood that there were kids and families who were still waiting out in the hallway and who hadn't been able to get into the hearing room. And so he asked that the people at the back doors, and I was one of those people, allow those families to come in. And in order to make room for those families, he invited the children and young adults with muscular dystrophy who were near the front of the room to come and fill in the seats for the senators who were members of the hearing committee, and said, we're going to invite those kids to be senators for the day in order to make room in the back for everyone else. And then once all of that happened, he proceeded with the hearing. So here's what, for me, when I think about the MD Care Act, really changed that day for the community. Both literally and figuratively, the Duchenne patient community moved from being on the fringes to forever being in the front of the room. From that day forward, the Duchenne community has never again been an afterthought. Nobody has ever doubted that when the community convenes, we won't show up, and that we would always be there for one another. So while the MD Care Act in that day yielded much, new champions, surveillance, increased funding for muscular dystrophy, care standards, coordinated research, so many important things. What I see the MD Care Act as really having done was that the MD Care Act galvanized the Duchenne community. It shifted the global conversation. It changed outcomes for Duchenne and the other muscular dystrophies. And most importantly, it demonstrated that every voice matters.
Thank you, Annie. I consider myself proud to call you friend and really family to PPMD and to this community. Whether you've participated in advocacy with us in our advocacy conference in Washington or have advocated from home in Truth, you've made a difference. And doing so has changed so much in our space over the last 20 years. We also recognize there's still a lot of work to be done. And while we're proud of the progress to date, we know there's so much more that we need to do together. So this year, we're going to be doing the advocacy conference virtually, as you've probably seen on our website. It does give an opportunity for so many of you to participate who may not have participated before, to dip your toe into advocacy. You'll be well supported by seasoned advocates. But we wanted to just give you a look at what the advocacy conference is all about. Here you go.
This is a hearing of the Appropriations Subcommittee for Labor, Health, Human Services, and Education. Today, the hearing has been scheduled at the specific request of the parent, Project Muscular Dystrophy, as part of their first annual legislative conference.
In 2001, the fight to end Duchenne arrived in Washington, D.C. Families like yours joined PPMD and dozens of others. We led that charge, and our voices made an impact. Mr. Chairman, Congress is very generous to NIH, but this disease, the #1 lethal genetic disease of childhood, gets only 1/1000th of the NIH budget. No wonder there is nothing available for these children. On behalf of the children with Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy and their families, and all of these people you see here with muscular dystrophies, we ask the federal government to commit $100 million over 5 years specifically for Duchenne research. Mr. Chairman, it's too late for my own sons, but with your help, this disease will change. Thank you. Almost 2 decades later, families like yours continue to move mountains on Capitol Hill in the fight to end Duchenne.
Here we are now with over 30 clinical trials. When we started, there were no clinical trials. There was a limited federal investment in the muscular dystrophies, in Duchenne in particular, and now we have hundreds of millions of dollars going to Duchenne research, all because you tell your story.
But the fight is far from finished, and your voice in Washington is needed now more than ever.
It's important to have new families here in Washington because there's strength in numbers. The more voices we have, the stronger impact we're going to have.
My son is 3, was diagnosed about 1.5 years ago with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and I just don't ever want to get to the end and say that I didn't do anything. And so to be able to do something and be here and have my voice heard seems really big.
PPMD's annual advocacy conference is the only official gathering on Capitol Hill for the Duchenne community. Over the course of 3 days, we prepare and schedule congressional meetings for new advocates like you to make a difference.
I think it's extremely important for new families that are coming to advocate. We need new families to come forward. I think their message is profound because they're in a different time than when Suzanne and I have been doing this. And the treatments that they're going to get are different than what we have gotten. And together, we're going to move mountains.
It's very empowering. A lot of what happens with Duchenne families is you feel out of control. You can't control what's happening with your son, and there's very little you can do. You can't suddenly go find a cure. But you can come here and you can use your voice and be empowered. It really is an empowering feeling to say, I'm doing something to help my son.
Meeting with lawmakers and staff may seem intimidating, but no one is more qualified than you.
Just make it like a conversation. If the issue is very important to you, they're going to want to listen and they're going to be receptive because you can't fake passion.
The biggest fear should be Duchenne and not speaking out to your member. Your member wants to know your story and hear. If you don't speak, who will on behalf of your child, your family? Your voice is important.
In fact, they need your input to help shape Duchenne research funding and federal policy.
If you come to Washington and educate your members of Congress, you will change the course of this disease. You will be responsible for your members of Congress becoming familiar with the disease, being willing to support legislation and funding that one day will lead to effective treatments and a cure.
PPMD's advocacy conference returns this winter. Visit endduchenne.org to learn how you can participate virtually and make a difference from home on Capitol Hill.
Join the fight in Washington, D.C.
and in your hometown.
Become an advocate for yourself and for others with muscular dystrophy.
Together, we can end Duchenne.
Join our fight, and together, we can end Duchenne. I love that message. Together we can end Duchenne. I think it's the most powerful message. And just as Miss Matsui said, show up, keep it up, and this is going to change. It has in 20 years. We still have work to do. After Senator Wellstone died, who would fill his shoes? Well, I'm thankful to say Senator Klobuchar has taken up his mantle and has done amazingly well, really supporting us in all things at all times. Let's hear from Senator Klobuchar.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to say a few words at today's 20th anniversary of Advocacy in Action event. I'm honored to address this group of advocates dedicated to ending Duchenne. Americans are living through, as you all know as much as I do, as I'm sitting on this laptop in front of my bookcase, we are living through one of the most challenging periods in our nation's history. More than 400,000 Americans have lost their lives to coronavirus, and millions more are suffering from the economic destruction of the pandemic. The moment in our nation's history calls for serious reflection and national resolve. But I want us to remember through all of this, as you know, by the work you do where you never give up hope, this is also a moment of hope. And last month, I was honored to speak at the inauguration of President Biden and Vice President Harris. And I said on that beautiful sunny morning, a moment that just cried out for people coming together. And Senator Blunt and I would not back down of having that inauguration outside with leaders from both parties up on that platform. And that happened, including Vice President Pence and President Bush. And as I said that day, this is the day our democracy picks itself up, brushes off the dust, and does what America always does, goes forward as one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So now it falls on all of us to take up the torch of our democracy, not as a weapon of political arson, but as an instrument for good. And you are already serving as an instrument for good with your work and your advocacy, because you are on the front lines fighting to ensure that people have access to therapies and that they receive optimal care. And you know what that means. My work on Duchenne muscular dystrophy began when I was elected to the Senate. It was an issue that my dear friend and former Minnesota Senator Paul Wellstone championed. He was instrumental in getting the Muscular Dystrophy Community Assistant Research and Education Act, or as we know it, MD CARE Act, signed into law in 2001. The bill dramatically increased investment at the National Institutes of Health for Muscular Dystrophy Research and included funding for the creation of 6 centers of excellence. In recognition of his work, all the centers share Senator Paul Wellstone's name. The bill also supported public health policies designed to improve quality of life and boost life expectancy of children and adults diagnosed with muscular dystrophy. Since the passage of the MD CARE Act, millions of dollars has been leveraged for muscular dystrophy research and education programs, including for Duchenne specifically. In 2008, I led the reauthorization of the MD CARE Act, and it passed the Senate unanimously. And in 2014, I worked with my friend Senator Wicker on the MD CARE amendments to build on that progress by ensuring that these efforts would focus on the most critical needs of doctors, patients, and researchers. They were important accomplishments, but more needs to be done. That's why I also worked with Senator Wicker to introduce the bipartisan Patient-Focused Impact Assessment Act, which was signed into law in 2016. We have a pretty good track record as part of the 21st Century Cures Act. This law now helps advocates understand how the FDA uses patient-focused drug development tools and how it engages patients, including those with rare diseases, as it reviews drugs and therapies. And now, Senator Wicker and I, we're not quitting. We've gone a step further in introducing the Benefit Act, which would ensure that patient experience and patient-focused drug development data is considered as part of risk assessments in the development of new therapies. I'm optimistic we can get this bill passed. We know we have a lot of work ahead of us. That's what you do every day. And we all know that the fight against Duchenne won't be won overnight. Treatments and cures take time. But we have made progress. We have done it together. And I can tell you, none of this would have gotten done without all of you and the people before you and the people that never gave up, either fighting for themselves, for their family members, for their neighbors, and for people they don't even know. That's an act of love and mercy. So thank you. Keep up the good work. Your advocacy matters, and it makes a difference now more than ever.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. We are so grateful for her leadership with the MD CARE Act, but also with bills, as she mentioned, outside of the MD CARE Act that we've worked on with she and Senator Wicker. And those bills have been focused around FDA and patient-focused drug development. And that brings us perfectly to our final panel with FDA. But first, I just want to have a few slides to throw up to talk about. So just a brief overview of our community's efforts in advocacy around FDA. This actually, as I said, is outside of the MD CARE Act. We've worked with Congress to support other pieces of legislation that impact rare disease and promote patient-focused drug development. We've worked with partners like the Every Life Foundation and others in the space that care about this, because this isn't just Duchenne specific. This really does touch all rare diseases. We have also conducted our own research to produce patient experience data. We disseminate those results to inform policy. We've disseminated those results to regulators, drug developers, and others in our space so they can better understand how you think and feel about emerging therapies and living with Duchenne. And we've engaged directly with FDA like we're doing today and have been grateful for their openness and willingness to work in collaboration with this community. This collaboration eventually led to the development of the first patient community draft guidance that we submitted to the FDA, with FDA producing their own guidance on Duchenne, which was finalized in 2018. So again, we're so thankful for that collaboration, and this has been able to create models for other rare diseases. So with that, I am grateful to the panel who is joining us today. Today we have Dr. Lei Zhu, who is with the Office of Tissue and Advanced Therapies for the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, also known as CBER. We have Dr. Michelle Campbell, who's the Senior Clinical Analyst for Stakeholder Engagement and Clinical Outcomes for the Division of Neurology Products with the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER. We also have PPMD board member Richard Klein, who's former director, Patient Liaison Program at the FDA. This is really an incredible panel to really cap off today's virtual town hall. We cannot thank you enough for being here and be willing to have this conversation. I want to just start with a general overview of who you are and what you do at the FDA and your role. And let's start with Michelle Campbell.
Thank you, Ryan and Pat, and hello to everyone who's watching. As Ryan said, my name is Michelle Campbell, and I lead stakeholder engagement and clinical outcomes, not only for the Division of Neurology, but also for the Office of Neuroscience, which incorporates neurology and our psychiatry divisions and some other divisions as well. And there, my role is to really work with our stakeholders and to engage with groups such as PPMD and have these discussions and bring together our medical officers and teams and having these discussions on how we can advance drug development and therapeutics in various diseases, but in particular our rare diseases. And also working on clinical outcomes and really helping identify what are clinical outcomes that will truly represent clinically meaningful change to patients and how we use them in clinical trials. So we really have good data that we can interpret when we have successful trials that come in for review.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Lei Zhu?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Pat, so much for inviting me and inviting CBER to this panel. So as Ryan mentioned, I'm from CBER OTAT. And I came to FDA right after my neurology residency about 11 years ago, first as a clinical reviewer, mostly review neurology indications involving the cell therapy, gene therapy products. And then in 2017, I became the branch chief. And also by that time, I think OTAT changed the name to this OTAT now because it used to call the Office of Tissues and Cell and Gene Therapy Products. Mm-hmm. So with that reorganization in 2016, 2017, we also regulate plasma-derived products such as immunoglobulins. And so my branch oversees clinical trials for the investigational product or those experimental products for neurology, ophthalmology, and some other indications. I think neurology occupies over 50% of the files in the branch. And my branch also approved the first 2 AAV-directed gene therapies. One is for a genetic form of eye disease, and the other one is for neurology indication, this spinal muscular atrophy. And so I think nowadays, especially over the last several years, I think the novel products, especially the gene therapy products, development have been booming in this in my office. And so I'm thrilled to be part of that.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll certainly get more into that in the discussion. And Richard Klein, perhaps you can give some background on yourself and your former role at FDA.
Okay, I can try. I spent virtually my entire career at FDA, and my engagement with patients began in the early 1990s with the AIDS community, AIDS HIV community. And the agency was under a lot of pressure to allow some input and communication with that community. And I think at the time, people didn't understand FDA's role, how the agency worked, and what the agency did. So I took on the role of trying to work with that community. And I think we established a lot of trust and a lot of interaction. And at the agency, the thought was, this is actually a very good thing. And maybe we can expand this to other patient communities. And originally it began with neurological diseases. By the time I left FDA just a few years ago, we had quite a robust relationship with over 200 different disease communities. And I think it was a very successful program. We instituted bringing patients officially onto advisory committee meetings as patient representatives who were full board members or panel members on those advisory committees. And I think it laid the groundwork for quite a bit of patient engagement with FDA.
That's wonderful. Pat?
That's pretty amazing. We're really thrilled to have you here. I think I'm going to start with Michelle. Michelle, certainly CEDAR has seen any number of Duchenne programs over time. Can you reflect on those programs? And are there any moments that you were like, aha, we learned something and now we know something different?
Yes, thank you, Pat. As Leigh said, for her and CBER on the gene therapy side, how much the growth has happened. We've seen the very same growth on our therapeutic sides for drugs in the Duchenne space, with it growing over time and with the recent approvals that we have had. And so I think there's a great interest. I think the understanding and good work that our patient groups have done to help us better understand the natural history and what does progression look like has really helped elevate and escalate and really push forward the development we have seen so far. And really helping us learn more about what can we expect and what can we think about treating. It also takes into account, we've learned from all of these past workings with engagement and with natural history is the multi-factorial aspect of the disease. I think it was said early on during your NIH talk when it was introduced that, we have to think about the heart because it's a muscle too, is that we've learning more about the impact on the other muscle-based organs and how do we account for that when we're looking into our developments and what are we measuring in terms of outcomes. I think some of the aha moment that, we would like to think about is really that we have a possibility of being able to use a biomarker. And what does that mean? Because, not often in the past with our neurologic diseases have we had something that is suggestive of clinical benefits. And the fact that we have something and that we're still learning about it every day and we're still working forward was really a big moment and helping us really change that landscape in drug development in Duchenne. And a lot of lessons learned that we can help other of our different various muscular dystrophy disorders outside of Duchenne and thinking about how to really approach those trial designs and those endpoints, and really thinking about what will work and how can we interpret that data when we receive it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And, we're so familiar with the accelerated approval pathway in CEDAR, right, based on the biomarker of dystrophin that was expressed based on skipping a single exon. And then, Lee, I'm going to come over to you and say a couple questions. One is there crosstalk? How do you learn from each other? Do you share data and discussions about what you're learning? And then if we look where you are in terms of the gene therapy arena in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, where a microdystrophin is going to be delivered, how do you think about a regulatory pathway? How do you think about flexibility there? And obviously, I know that we're in really early days. So I'd love to just kind of pick your brain about how that's being thought about.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. I think as you alluded to, the gene therapy for Duchenne still is in the early stage of the development. And we are learning as we are exploring along with the sponsors. And we, regarding interactions with CEDAR neurology group, we have had regular kind of informal meetings between the groups. And also, whenever I have questions, I would reach out to them, either formally or informally, to get their feedback. For example, like what kind of outcome measures could be used in a reasonably, when the trial is designed for example, 1 year or 2 year length, and whether that outcome is clinically meaningful, and what their recommendation or comments regarding the enrollment criteria, etc. So I think we have been pretty interactive between the two centers with regarding not only to the Duchenne, but all other conditions, because I think it is critical to ensure the consistency when we provide advice or comments to the different stakeholders.
Thank you. So please go on. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know whether, regarding the accelerated approval, I think it is one of the 5, expedited programs at FDA. So the criteria are the same. As Michelle mentioned, for the accelerated approval, we're using something called a surrogate endpoint, which could be a marker that can be measured in the laboratory or could be measured as during the physical exam. But because the product that CEDAR regulates and we regulate are different, so the biomarker that used for each of the product is different. And so we have to evaluate the data that have been accumulated over the development to assess whether that particular biomarker for a particular product could be reasonably likely to predict a clinically meaningful benefit to those patients with Duchenne. When we're talking about a clinically meaningful benefit, we are talking about how patients feel, function, and survive. But I think for Duchenne, what matters the most are how they function and how they survive. So I think that's something we have to work along with the sponsors to generate the data to support that particular marker they are choosing is really likely to predict such a likelihood.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's hard. You mentioned the approval of Zolgensma for SMA1, and in that disease, you have a very tight window of decline and death, right, in a short period of time. I think the struggle we all have, and probably CEDAR has experienced this too, is the length of progression here. So it's not short; it's a progression over years. And I think when even as parents, when we see a 6-month or a 12-month, while maybe we are perceptive enough to see subtle changes that might be more difficult to measure, it really is a longer view that we take, right? And I think there isn't a parent that gets up every morning and prays that, never mind progression, just stabilize the disease here. Don't let him go any further, right? Let him stay with the same function. So I wonder how you think about stability in terms of not in an outcome measure rather than seeing an incline. If you saw stability for 12 months, would that make sense in a progressive disease? Or, I'm just trying to think out loud about, this is a hard disease. It's a hard disease to track based on its delay, based on the length of progression.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I understand that part. I think for a disease, if you could stabilize, even if, like, for example, a modest effect on the patient's function, I think that's worthwhile to say there is a benefit there. But in the meantime, when we're talking about a relatively modest effect, I think that's critical to have a concurrent control group or a comparator arm to compare with. And with appropriate blinding, then you can detect such a modest but still clinically meaningful benefit between the two groups. Because talking about Zolgensma, that one was approved based on 2 open-label studies. Mm-hmm. But that's because the effect is very dramatic. You see the difference. A majority of the patients, they do not need a ventilator. They were alive, which we know it won't happen without treatment. Mm-hmm. But if that effect is much smaller, then we will have to ask for a concurrent control arm so that we can see whether the gene therapy would provide any benefit when that benefit is not that large.
Right. It's just, I think we have a community that's long been without treatments, and we're so anxious to see these treatments come through. Obviously, we want safe and effective drugs, so that it's not in any way a request to lower the bar or change the regulatory process. It really is to sort of try to map time against the process itself and try to see where we can intervene to make things go a little faster or be a little more apparent. We think about going as fast as we can, like a conditional approval, and then looking later or looking longer. So I appreciate that. And I think, we are just at the beginning of gene therapies. And as you know, you're seeing these gene therapies come through in terms of the numbers of patients, the age of patients that are coming into the gene therapies or into this phase of the therapies. Richard, I'm just going to ask you, I know a lot of parents have contacted sponsors, and they've probably contacted FDA as well about, okay, I would like to use right to try or compassionate use, or how can I get access and how can I get access to the therapy outside a clinical trial because the person I love doesn't fit into the protocol at this moment. So Richard, can you describe the difference in those? What are those processes? How hard are they? And when and how do you get those kinds of things addressed?
And I believe we have some slides, Richard, that we can throw up that you've provided, correct?
Okay, yes, we do.
Great.
Put up. But obviously the best way to get a drug to the most people is to get it approved. And by showing that it's safe and effective, it has a meaningful effectiveness and it has a safety profile that balances against any potential risks. That would be the best way to get a drug there. But obviously a lot of people cannot get into clinical trials. The clinical trials are a process, and people don't have time necessarily to wait, particularly in a disease like Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So what expanded access is it's a pathway that was created and it's regulated by the FDA, and it allows manufacturers to provide investigational drugs to patients who have serious and life-threatening conditions, who've exhausted approved therapy or don't have alternative therapy options, and they are not able to participate in a clinical trial. So this is also commonly referred to as compassionate use or pre-approval access. And this has been in existence since the 1970s, so it has quite a history. And it really came to the fore with the HIV epidemic, became codified in 1987, meaning it went into the Code of Federal Regulations and became part of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So it's an established process. We can go to the next slide, please. In 2018, another pathway became available. So there's the established FDA expanded access pathway or track, and there's also now the right to try track. The right to try track emerged through state legislation, and therefore different states have different rules about right to try. But in 2018, a federal law was passed and right to try was added to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act also. So let me just go through the differences if we can get the next slide. Where they originated, essentially the FDA expanded access process developed through the FDA regulatory procedures over a number of years. Right to try was created, as I said, passed in 2018 by Congress. Patient eligibility is slightly different. For FDA's traditional process, if we can call it that, it's for an immediately life-threatening or serious disease or condition. Right to try is only for a life-threatening disease or condition. And the definitions are listed in the Code of Federal Regulations. The number of patients. FDA allows expanded access for single patients, for small groups of patients, and for broad access to a large group of patients. Under right to try, the only accessibility is for a single patient. The treatment options, very similar. No treatment options, not eligible to get into a clinical trial for the investigational product. That's across the board for both. Both of them require that the request be made by a treating physician, a licensed physician in the state. And for the expanded access procedures, the physician needs to make the request to the sponsor, the company who manufactures that product, and also with FDA. Right to try is only between the treating physician and the company. So the FDA role, right to try essentially was developed to remove FDA completely from the process. Under expanded access, FDA plays what I would consider to be a very important role. Safety review based on the preclinical and the clinical data. FDA can and often does. I think the last study I saw was about 11% of situations where there are requests, FDA might recommend ways to improve the protocol and monitor for safety when it's necessary. But it also ensures that patient protections are in place, and that would be the Institutional Review Board review and informed consent. And as I said, right to try, there is no role for FDA whatsoever until after the access. And the final slide, please. So product availability, this is a really important part. The sponsor or the manufacturer must be able and willing to provide that product. So I think that right to try is somewhat of a misnomer because it gives you a right to ask, but it doesn't necessarily mean that someone will get access. Under both of these situations, both of these tracks, it's the sponsor who has to make a decision that they're able and they're willing to make that product available to the patient or patients. So involvement and oversight, it's the manufacturer or sponsor who makes the initial decision under the expanded access program. FDA generally agrees. I would say from the data that has been accumulated, FDA allows more than 99.6% of the requests to go forward. And it does require that there's an institutional review board that reviews and approves the protocol, make sure that the physician is able to administer that drug, that the conditions are there for that drug to be provided to the patient. On the right to try side, it is only the manufacturer or the sponsor who provides oversight for the physician. In the expanded access, it's the applicable to drugs, to biologics, and also to medical devices. Right to try is only for drugs that have passed phase 1 and are drugs or biologics, does not apply to medical devices. Also, in the on the FDA track for expanded access, there are no restrictions on what stage of development the product is in. So it can be very early stage, it can be late stage development, and it can also be for products that are no longer being developed. So it's a very flexible program. Informed consent, as I said, there are regulations under the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 50, that set out the standards for what information needs to be provided by informed consent to make sure that patients really understand the language, to make sure they understand this is an investigational product, that there are unknown risks, and that the benefits are not established either. There is an informed consent requirement under right to try, but the law specifically excludes the requirements of Part 50. So in other words, the informed consent has no oversight and no control. There are charging regulations that allow a company to recoup the cost of the expanded access availability. So FDA only allows direct costs for manufacturing and providing that product, not to make a profit. The same thing is imposed on the right to try, except that there's no documentation requirement. So there's a lot less control over how much can be recouped in the cost. And finally, adverse event reporting, which I think is very important. There are specific requirements at FDA, and these are based on the severity and the suspected relationship of an adverse event to an investigational product that have to be reported to the agency. In right to try, there's only an annual reporting requirement for adverse events. So if there's a significant adverse event, FDA can let other people know, the IRB has to be informed, and patients who are in the clinical trial will learn about an adverse event that's suspected or shown to be directly related to the investigational agent. That's not going to be the case in right to try. And I think that's a tremendous weakness of right to try, because it compromises patient safety and research subject safety.
Thank you, Richard. It's sometimes so complicated, right? And I think that when you have a child or love someone with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, you're so anxious to do the right thing and to try to access treatments as quickly as possible, obviously, to get that idea, please don't let this disease progress any further. But the patient voice comes back to, we've done a lot of preference studies, and certainly Ryan has led those. I'd love for Michelle and you, Lee, to also comment on how do you think about the patient voice in terms of preference studies, benefit risk, what sort of good they expect for what sort of risks they'll take on, and how do you see that as being integral or not to the review process? Michelle, I'll have you start, and then we'll go to you, Lee.
So I think of patient voice every day as part of our everyday job when we're reviewing applications or INDs that come in, drug development programs that are coming in. It's so critical. Our patient-focused drug development efforts that have occurred over the last decade have really put the patient and their voice and their experience to the forefront more ever than in the past. And particularly our rare diseases have really led that charge and making sure that their voices have been heard throughout the drug development process. So for me, any way we can learn from that patient lived experience is always informative to us, either in our everyday when we're reviewing things that are coming in, or if it is submitted into an application. It can be very useful when we're looking at maybe complicated application where the benefits is modest and maybe there's a safety signal, maybe there's not. Is this meaningful to patients? What is their thoughts on it? It can truly be informative. But we also need to make sure that we're capturing the patient voice correctly and that we're measuring the correct things. We're asking those right questions that as it relates to that specific drug development program. And so that when it does come to time where we really want to need to use it in these situations where we have uncertainty, we want to make sure that we actually have the voice is correct and the information we're receiving is actually going to be informative for our decision making. And it can be, but there are instances when the wrong questions were asked, and it still just adds to our perplexing nature of what are we supposed to do. So I think this is why we encourage people to come in early and talk about what are their plans, what is the your study design, what are you going to measure. Coming in early and having that plan is important, and I'm also encouraging people to make sure they're thinking about how to incorporate the patient voice in the drug development program early as well is important. So it's not just it's time for that pivotal trial and we're going to do it now. That talk should have already happened prior into knowing what's important to patients. So to me, it's every day. It's our everyday job, and it's just it's something that we always do when we incorporate. And I think people don't always realize that we really sit down and when we're having our conversations is this meaningful to patients? What will this impact be for their lives? Is our question we're trying to answer every day.
Thank you. Lee, how do you think about this?
I think I just want to echo what Michelle has just mentioned. And to me, over the last 10 years, comparing the first 5 years versus the last 5 years, when this approval 6 was in place, and we have had a lot more patient-focused drug development programs. And I feel I have learned a lot. From Duchenne perspective, I think the one I was impressed the most was the one, I think those non-ambulatory, like young adults with Duchenne or Becker. And I think they just expressed their voice because there were no trials targeting them. And I think from that moment on, I think we have been pushing sponsors more, not only to focus on those ambulatory young boys, but also focus on those older non-ambulatory patients because they also need something for their function and for their life.
Lei, you bring up a good point. I think in our community, well, first of all, we're thankful for trials. That's first, right? And we certainly understand dosing the amount of virus you need based on weight. So the bigger the person, obviously the more virus you're going to need. I think that our worry, right now is the little guys are being involved in trials, the 4 to 6ers or 4 to 7s, and especially with the pandemic, some families who are really anxious to be screened and be considered as a candidate for a clinical trial in that first phase, phase 3, depending on or 2 or wherever the sponsor is, and then due to the pandemic and trials being delayed and everything, the whole world being delayed, reaching their 7th or their 8th birthday, in getting outside the window. I think the other thing that the community is really worried about is that window, right? That once you turn 8 years old, what we, at least in my view, when my boys were diagnosed, they used to call those 4 to 7s the golden years, where kids get a little better, they refine their muscle movement. And then the doctor said to me, by the time they're 8 or 9, they're going to have plateaued and be on the decline. So it's that window, that 8 to 12, 13 window, where there is a fragility, I think, in terms of functional measures for these little kids. And I appreciate you encouraging sponsors to look at that cohort of boys or that age group, because while I realize they require a higher dose or a bit more virus and there's production issues, there's still the opportunity, and again, data to be collected, understanding, evaluation, analysis, that maybe, with some luck, we could preserve that, right? We could preserve that function, preserve that ambulation, preserve that arm function, and certainly breathing and so on. So I'm really grateful to you for encouraging sponsors, and we too as a community are reaching out to sponsors to ask that. I'm going to ask you to define a word, because I find it very confusing, and it's called regulatory flexibility. What does that mean? And I'm going to start back with you, Lee, and then I'm going to go through everyone. What does that mean? And how because it's a term that's tossed around in a number of circumstances, well, regulatory flexibility, and I think, Okay, so what does that mean in real life? So could you talk to us about that?
Okay, so I will try. So I think my understanding of this regulatory flexibility is more toward the rare diseases. Because in common conditions like high blood pressure or even heart failure, I think the regulatory standard is at least 2 adequate and well-controlled studies. Each provide evidence of effectiveness and safety, and then together they provide substantial evidence of effectiveness and safety for the marketing approval. And also it means like the usual clinical development path is you start from the preclinical study, and then you start the phase 1 dose finding study, and then you do the phase 2 to further kind of explore the dosing regimen, etc. And then you do the phase 3 studies. But when we are facing with the rare diseases, because of the amount of unmet medical needs, and also because of the limited number of the patients with the certain conditions, I think we have not been so strict about this phase 1, 2, 3, and we also have not saying that the 2 adequate and well-controlled study will be required before you can submit for the license application. And also, I think we also are more flexible regarding the outcome measures. But also, I think because of the relatively small number of patients, we really feel the patients are really valuable. So we want to make full use of this valuable resource. And that's why at least for OTAT, we have been really advocate for starting the trial with a randomization and a concurrent control design in mind, so that even the phase 1 study has the potential to provide evidence of effectiveness to support the approval. Because I remember when I reviewed the phase 1 trial for the SMA, and that was 8 years ago. I mean, in my mind, I was thinking about safety. That's it. But now, 8 years later, I would have asked more about the product readiness, about whether a control group would be a better design than the open label single arm just dose escalation study. So because as we have seen over the last 10 years, I mean, some of the gene therapy products, especially those really targeting the underlying pathogenesis, and also when they have pretty kind of impressive preclinical data to support that potential, I think the sponsors should think the phase 1 may have that potential to be used to support the effectiveness, in addition to provide the safety as a first in-human study.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That was very helpful.
Really
we
helpful.
are certainly very hopeful about the studies that you're seeing come through, and very hopeful for stability again and improvement in the patients and expansion to the over 8-year-olds. And we'll keep going on that vein for a very long time. Michelle, regulatory flexibility.
So it's going to be very similar to what Leigh said. We're often seeing this with our rare diseases when we have a limited patient population. And so we know that the difficulty of being able to have maybe 2 phase 3 trials as a possibility could be difficult. But I think what I would really want to encourage is that if this is going to happen in our rare disease space, this is why we encourage you to come and talk to us early. Come and have these pre-IND meetings, because if we can lay out the plan of what you're thinking of your development program as early, we can offer you the best advice. And with that advice, we're hopeful that you'll have a more successful trial, because oftentimes, if we're seeing results and it's a modest effect and we're not really sure if it's clinically meaningful or we're detecting a small change, that really can be difficult to see if the flexibility can be used, if we have really uncertainty with the results. And so we understand that a lot of our rare diseases, particularly or ultra rare, we don't have the population. Or for Duchenne, we're really focusing on that specific age range, as you said, Pat, that 4 to 8 year olds, where maybe the best opportune time, if we're going to slow progression, things like that we don't have, the vastness of our more common diseases and disorders where you can have thousands of patients. And so we truly want to make sure that we're utilizing our patient population correctly and adequately. And so I think if you have these conversations early, then I think when we can apply regulatory flexibility in our rare diseases, you can ought to be more successful with these conversations happening. But to the challenges that are faced with how do you do this is very similar to what Leigh said that we would consider. Do we have randomized control? Does it make sense to have it? How is the drug working? Is it safe? All of those same questions we want to see, but earlier planning in that design, we can provide you early and better advice on what are the appropriate outcomes, or maybe we're going to be measuring maybe some outcomes that we wouldn't measure in phase 2 as often if we were in a bigger disease, that we think that maybe in phase 2, it could be supportive, and we should be measuring it now to help us understand what is really happening when we do get a marketing application that comes in.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. It's just the design is really so important, I think, to really understand what the function and survive part, right? Are they stable? Are they functioning better? Are they stabilizing so that they don't lose function? Because mapping a phase 1 through 3 trial in terms of years is against a rare disease that's progressive is just heartbreaking in every way.
Yeah.
Richard, advice, regulatory flexibility. You're going to fix it for us.
The Code of Federal Regulations spells out how trials are developed and how they're run and what the regulatory requirements are. And obviously, particularly in rare diseases, those standards may not fit. So I certainly agree with Michelle and Leigh about how, particularly with a small population, you need to figure out ways to make it a little more flexible and make it work and have an ability to allow differences from the standard that you would use for something like blood pressure. But if I could backpedal just a little bit to the patient engagement topic, something that I think is so important but hasn't been mentioned is that it's really a very much two-way street. And I think that you, Ryan, and Pat, when patients become engaged with the agency, they learn about the scientific evidentiary background that's so necessary. And I think people look at FDA as a bureaucratic organization. I think it is not bureaucratic at all. It's extremely thoughtful. It's scientific. I felt so privileged to spend all those years with brilliant people who cared a lot about developing drugs. I think everybody wants the same thing, something safe, something effective, and something that is going to really treat or cure a disease. And when we had patients talk and communicate and work with the agency, they learned the scientific considerations, they learned the regulatory framework, the regulatory restrictions that the agency is under, and I think gain a real appreciation for the challenges that the people at the agency do face.
Thank you, Richard. I think I agree with you. When, long ago when my boys were diagnosed, it felt like the FDA was this black box that no one could touch, and that things were done in secret, and that was just a perception. I had no way to even make the assumption, but I think since we've been here, the 20 years, coming into the FDA, really being welcomed with open arms. I remember when Janet Woodcock, when we said, let's write a guidance, why don't you write a guidance? And she said to us, why don't you write a guidance? And it was really quite an endeavor for us to take on, but something we really learned about. We learned about the complexities, hard to measure dystrophin. How do you quantify it? What tests? So I feel that our community has been welcomed by the FDA. I think the other good thing about this is we get to know you as people with families who care deeply about what you do. But we're always going to ask the pushy questions, and I, apologize ahead of time for that, because when we look at time and we look at function here, none of that is on our side. So the degree that we can push things, ask you questions, maybe even cause a little pressure if we can, hurry up, let's get to this, we will, because I think our voice matters, and our sons matter so much, and some of our daughters as well, who are carriers but are manifesting. We really are driven to find answers with you. So to the extent that we can be helpful to you, if there's something that we could do that would inform you, help you better, really do something to accelerate, you have a willing community of people out here. And I can say to you that I feel incredibly blessed that you're in our ecosystem. I'm really happy to know all of you, and I'm really happy to say that you're keeping our sons safe. At the same time, I wish you Godspeed to keep them functional and living for a very long time so they can grow up and grow old. So I can't thank you enough for being on this panel. I can't thank you enough for what you do. And please know this is our 20th anniversary. We're going to come back to you, and we're going to ask you for webinars so that we can talk much more, instead of just quickly in the matter of 45 minutes to 50, we'd like to really have some one-on-one sessions with you so we can learn from you and you can learn from us. But in the meantime, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for all you do. We so appreciate you.
Thank you for all you do.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And now, we're going to hear from Janet Woodcock. I think this community knows Janet Woodcock really, really well. She was certainly with us in that first advisory committee, and even before that, when we sat down with Janet and told her our stories and talked to her about the importance of therapies. So Janet's been with us and with this Duchenne community for a very long time. She attended the advocacy meetings, she attended the AdComs, and certainly has been responsive. And now, as acting commissioner of the FDA, she wanted to say a few words. So please, let's hear from Janet.
Hello, I'm Janet Woodcock. I'm the director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And I'm really happy to be able to address this community that means so much to me. It's hard to believe it's been 20 years since the federal government recognized the need for support and research into muscular dystrophy and passed legislation, landmark legislation, that has really led to tremendous research and collaboration. We've come a long way from that time, but we do have still a long way to go. Today, those who passed the legislation probably wouldn't recognize the world that we're in. In fact, between NIH, the FDA, the patient advocacy organizations, and the research industry, we're all focused on ameliorating this disease and developing better treatments. And really, the light is there at the end of the tunnel. We can really see how we're going to get there. And we wouldn't get there without all this collaboration across all the different sectors. Not only do we just need research at NIH, we need patient advocacy. We need to hear the patient voice. We need to understand how people feel and what matters to them about the disease, and how we can best track the progress and improvement with treatments. We need to be able to have trials where we can compare treatments and really good outcome measures. We need around the world collaboration so that research labs in different countries are not working in isolation, that we're all focused toward the same goal. And I think I can say sincerely from FDA and from all researchers and advocates around the world that we feel confident that our joint efforts are really going to lead to tremendous improvements in outcomes for everyone with muscular dystrophy. And that can't happen soon enough. So thank you all for what you do. We will stand there beside you.
Now we're going to talk about the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense is one of our federal partners. Let's put up those slides, please. So in the Department of Defense, which is another very large research budget, there are specific, disease-specific programs under that budget as well. They're called congressionally directed medical research programs. This is what Senator Wellstone referred to in terms of his funding. So in the Department of Defense, for the last many years, we've had a CDMRP. This has funded many, many projects for developing drugs for exon skipping, gene therapy, clinical trial readiness, and any number of areas that are important to Duchenne. Next slide, please. You can see in the funding where in 2000 there wasn't anything in Duchenne. In 2003, this was after the implementation of the MD Care Act, funding started to come in the CDMRP program. In 2008, it spiked up to about $8.5 million. And then it stayed pretty static for the next years. But in 2020, thanks to our congressional champions and certainly your voices, there was an increase in the CDMRP program to $10 million, which is extraordinary. This is a program that's annually funded, so it needs your voice. And we will see and hopefully continue this funding at the $10 million level. The person instrumental for this was Joel Wood. Joel Wood has been an advocate. As I mentioned, he was one of the first people I met in Washington, D.C. after James was diagnosed. But Joel has been right by our side in advocacy from day one. So let's hear from Joel Wood.
Hi, everybody. It's Joel Wood. I am, Dana and I are the parents to James Richard Wood. James is 23 years old, was diagnosed in the year 2000 at Children's National Medical Center here in Washington. In the room when he was diagnosed was Annie Kennedy, who was the local representative, the regional representative for the Muscular Dystrophy Association. And on this, the 20th anniversary of the PPMD's engagement and advocacy, and I will say the first engagement of any organization of any kind, of any significance or clout, was the PPMD. It is gratifying, and I'm a little wistful of the many memories, most of which are really good and solid. You know, it's one of those things about muscular dystrophy and Duchenne is that we don't wish this disorder on anyone, but we are so grateful when for those who have contributed to the cause, who join us in the cause, and who have enriched the lives of not only my family, but many, many others. So when I first, so I'm a lobbyist, been in Washington for pushing 40 years. And obviously this is a time that is, filled with deep political polarization and animosity, and hopefully we can get past this and we'll be in a time of healing for all of us, in not only from COVID, but from a political poison, and that we can get some practical things done, because it really means a lot to our families. When I first joined in and learned that terrible news that my son had this disease, I asked in that room on that terrible bleak day in May of 2000, so where do I go? Who do I see? And I was told by the genetic counselor at Children's National, you should contact this woman, Pat Furlong. Pat rapidly put me in contact with the one person that she had helped connect the dots for Advocacy, who was Sherry Gunvelson up in northern Minnesota, who was just wearing the phones out and making friends. And here I am, a conservative Reagan Revolution Republican, and I'm being told that the only real champion that had been identified because of Sherry Gunvelson was the most liberal member, more liberal than Ted Kennedy. The most liberal member of the United States Senate. He was Bernie before there was Bernie, was Senator Paul Wellstone. And the remarkable partnership was forged between Senator Roger Wicker, Senator Paul Wellstone, Senator Sue Collins, many thanks to Brian Danger on that. Look, a lot to celebrate, a lot to do. The reality was that when my son was diagnosed, less than 1 in 2,500 of the NIH budget was spent on the world's #1 lethal childhood genetic disease. The #1 genetic child killer got 1/2,500. It was a result of that lack of advocacy. And so we all know the story that has ensued. We didn't have any private biopharma investment in the community to speak of. We had a smattering of academic settings around the world that were engaged in it. And it was frankly much more lucrative for scientists to research other disorders, even though ours was very simple, readily identifiable flaws on a single gene. And the prospects of gene therapy and RNA type strategies that are so extraordinary for Duchenne, but were not being realized. The result now, billions of dollars worth of investment fueled by scientific research at NIH, CDC, and other agencies as leverage for private investment, for academic research, for other philanthropic organizations. But the beginning of it was to get the government back engaged. Honestly, as much as I would love to celebrate the scores of clinical trials, the advancements that have been made in treatment, the reality is that the commitment to DMD over the last decade of wildly increasing budgets at NIH has not shown up in proportion to the severity of this disease. We need you more than ever. The PPMD is going to have its legislative conference in March. I urge everyone to be actively engaged in this. Last comment I'll give you. So just the past week, I was in a conversation back at Children's Hospital with the orthopedic surgeon. We were having to consider the spinal fusion surgery for James. And she actually said, you know, James, this is an odd conversation because 15 years ago, let's just be honest, I wasn't going to be talking to you at the age of 23 about what the long-term risks, benefits, rewards from a surgery like this are, because we don't even know how advanced this has all been. We all used to be able to reliably say what the life expectancy is. We changed that. PPMD has changed that. You've helped change that. Please be a part of it. We have miles yet to go. I am so down not to see you in person, so excited that this 20th anniversary is filled with so much hope and expectation for a better day for all of our boys. Lots of love to all of you. Hope to see you in person before too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. We love you, man. And we are so proud of the partnership we've had with Fed over the years for all you do. I forgive you for calling you Ryan Seacrest at the virtual summer conference. And we are quite sure we'll be working closely together in the coming weeks and months as we roll out the advocacy agenda. So this is going to conclude our virtual town hall. We really, really appreciate you joining us. You know, I think I said it earlier, we haven't done any of this alone. PPMD works across the space with other foundations, organizations, families, industry, so many congressional champions. You know, we want to thank all of you. We want to thank our ecosystem because together we are making progress. And with that, I'm going to give Pat the final word.
Well, just a final word to say, we are grateful to all of you. It's our us. It's us who can make a difference. It's our voices. It's our sons. It's our daughters. It's our families. All of us together have made such a change. We still have places to go, and we will together. This is bipartisan across the aisle, across the country, and across the globe. We need to end Duchenne. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you in person soon. Remember, March 3rd is virtual, but after that, at some point we'll be together. Thank you again.